candle burned down to a stub before the last stitch went in. She did not weep. She counted the pence they would take from her wages. In a garret above a Mayfair townhouse, a young woman called Mrs. Vale bent over a torn rose-pink gown that did not belong to her. Her own dress was string-colored wool, mended at the elbows, the shawl brown and thin. A drop of wax fell on the silk. Downstairs, Lady Hyacinth Bertie shrieked that sixpence would be docked. Miss Cassandra Bertie laughed and called her a ginger scarecrow. Tabitha Harcourt said nothing. When the door closed, she cut a single stitch in the lining of her own bodice and drew out a heavy gold ring. A boar and 3 stars, the sigil of a viscountcy the world believed extinct. She pressed it once to her lips and sewed it back into the dark. The next morning, the Morning Post carried an advertisement. The Earl of Bramwell, the man they called the Ice Lord of Grosvenor Square, was offering double wages for a governess to his 2 orphan wards. In a cold library that smelled of beeswax and old paper, Marcus Marbury turned the applicant's letter under a single lamp. He read the hand. He read it again. He set his signet ring, the same boar, the same 3 stars, beside the page, and spoke to his solicitor without looking up. "Summon her tomorrow. Do not tell her my name." She walked into his house in her mended shawl, unaware that he had already been waiting for her for 10 years. Before the story begins, comment down below where you are watching from and what time it is there. If stories of justice, dignity, and love that arrives against all odds move you, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a member and help our channel. London, March of 1818, and the snow fell without sound over Mayfair. In the narrow attic above the Bertie townhouse on Grosvenor Street, a single tallow candle guttered on a chipped saucer, and Tabitha Harcourt bent low over a mound of pale pink silk, drawing her needle through the seam of a debutante's ball gown that was not her own. Her fingers were cold. She flexed them once, then took up the needle again. The gown belonged to Miss Cassandra Bertie, and it had torn along the hem for the 3rd time that fortnight. Tabitha had learned the exact geography of that hem. She knew where Cassandra had trodden on it descending the carriage steps at Lady Sefton's rout. She knew the small brown stain, the size of a shilling, where a footman had spilled ratafia. She knew the place where Cassandra had caught it on the fender at Almack's and blamed a chambermaid. Tabitha knew everything, and Tabitha said nothing. The candle wavered. She drew the light closer, mindful of the wick, mindful of every inch of tallow. Lady Hyacinth counted the candles. A small, precise stitch. Another. The rose silk was fragile as a moth's wing, and Tabitha's needle moved through it as if through water. She had been taught to sew, once, by a French governess in a house that no longer answered to her family's name. She had been taught many things there: Latin from her father, French from Mademoiselle, watercolors from her mother, the pruning of roses from the head gardener at Ravenhill. She had been 10 years old when she copied recipes for rose water into her mother's still-room book in a round, careful hand. She had been 16 when the creditors came. Now she was 22, and she was called Mrs. Vale. The name was not hers. Neither was the widow's ring of jet on her smallest finger, which had belonged to a housekeeper in Bath who had taken pity on her one wet afternoon and pressed it into her palm before dying. The ring was a shield. In service, a widow was permitted a quiet dignity. A spinster of 22, with a hidden name and no letters of introduction, would have been turned into the street. She wore a day dress of straw-colored wool, the collar high and plain, the waist cut in the older Regency line because the fabric had been reset twice. Over it lay a brown shawl of coarse wool, mended at both elbows in wool of a nearly matching brown, though not quite. Cotton gloves lay folded on the deal table beside her. Her boots were black and thin at the sole. Her hair, the vivid copper of autumn beech, had been drawn back so severely into a low knot that the pull of it made her scalp ache, but no strand escaped, and no strand would. She had learned that neatness was a form of armor. From the story below came the sound of a pianoforte struck too hard. Cassandra was practicing a Scottish air for Wednesday's card party. She struck a wrong note and swore, softly, in the voice of a very young woman who had never been contradicted. Tabitha did not lift her head. The needle went in. The needle came out. A boot creaked on the attic stair. Tabitha's hand did not falter, but her spine tightened by a hair's breadth. She knew the tread of every person in the household, the housekeeper's soft slap of slippers, the butler's long, measured step, the scullery girl's hurried patter. This was Lady Hyacinth's tread, heavy at the heel, quick at the toe, the tread of a woman who had climbed by force of will and expected the stairs to know it. The door opened without a knock. Lady Hyacinth Bertie stood in the doorway, and the small room shrank to accommodate her. She was not a tall woman, but she carried herself as though gilding herself with height. Her hair, gray at the roots and dyed a hard chestnut, was banded in the old-fashioned Grecian mode. Her wrapper was of purple silk, heavy with a fringe of gold thread, and 3 ropes of large, poorly matched pearls hung at her throat. Her small brown eyes traveled the room and found their mark. Mrs. Vale, my lady. Tabitha rose, curtsied, and sat again without lifting her eyes from the gown. Lady Hyacinth crossed to the table in 3 steps. She lifted the pink silk between finger and thumb, as though it were a dead mouse. "There is wax," she said, "upon the bodice." Tabitha said nothing. She had noticed the wax as soon as she took up the gown. A single droplet, no larger than a lentil, had struck the silk before she could shield it. It would come out with spirits of wine and a warm iron. She had already fetched the spirits from the cupboard. "I did not permit you to burn a candle at the seams," Lady Hyacinth said. "The lamp was extinguished, my lady. Miss Cassandra requires the gown by Wednesday morning." "You will not answer me back." "No, my lady." Lady Hyacinth let the silk fall. She drew her purple wrapper more tightly about her, though the room was cold enough that Tabitha's breath had made small ghosts against the window. "6 pence," said Lady Hyacinth. "My lady? 6 pence to be docked from your quarter for the ruin of the silk." The silk was not ruined. Tabitha knew this, and Lady Hyacinth knew it, and both of them knew that the other knew. But 6 pence was 6 pence, and Lady Hyacinth would take it, because taking it was the shape of her pleasure. Tabitha inclined her head. "As you wish, my lady." Lady Hyacinth stood a moment longer, as though disappointed that no protest had come to slap down. Then she turned, and the purple silk of her wrapper hissed against the doorway, and her tread went heavily down the attic stair. Tabitha counted to 20. Only then did she permit herself to breathe. She looked at the small droplet of wax on the pink silk, and she did not weep. She had left her weeping at 17, in the small pantry at Ravenhill, when the last of her father's servants had come to say goodbye. She had used up her weeping there. It had never returned. She reached for the spirits of wine, wetted a rag, and pressed it gently to the wax. The wax lifted. She wetted the rag again, and pressed again and again, until no trace remained. Then she took the small flat iron from the hob at the little grate, tested it against her palm, and passed it, once, across a linen cloth laid upon the silk. The gown lay again smooth and unmarked. She took up her needle. The door burst open a second time. Cassandra Bertie stood on the threshold in a morning gown of white muslin, embroidered with sprigs of blue, her honey-colored curls loosed from their papers, her small pink mouth already open. "Mrs. Vale," Cassandra said, "you shall alter the sash. Mamma says the pink is too pale for my complexion." She was 19, and her voice had the flat certainty of a child who had never been made to wait. "Miss Bertie." Tabitha set down her needle. "The sash is of a single length. To alter its shade, I would have to procure new silk." "Then procure it." "Miss Bertie, the shops will not be open until—" "Then send Molly. Send Betsy. Send whom you please. Only do not stand there like a stump." Tabitha rose. She curtsied. The curtsy was exact, neither too deep nor too shallow, a governess's curtsy given to a girl 3 years her junior. Cassandra caught the exactness of it, and it displeased her. "You look at me," Cassandra said, "as though you were the mistress and I the maid." "I did not intend such a look, Miss Bertie. It is your face. Your face does it without your intending. That ginger hair and those pale eyes. A ginger scarecrow, Mamma calls you." "Did you know? A ginger scarecrow in a straw hat." Tabitha's eyes did not lift from the floor, but the muscle at the hinge of her jaw tightened, and released, and tightened again. "I did not know, Miss Bertie." "Well," Cassandra tossed her curls, "now you do. See that the sash is altered by Wednesday." She was gone before Tabitha could raise her head. Tabitha stood a moment where she was. Then she crossed to the little grate and knelt and set her cold hands against the low bank of dying coals until feeling returned to her fingers. The coals hissed faintly as they cooled. She did not curse the girl. She did not curse the mother. She had learned, at 14, from her own mother's example, that a woman who cursed her tormentors gave them her voice, and Tabitha would give them nothing that could be spent. She rose. She returned to the pink gown. The needle went in. The needle came out. The clock in the hall below struck 2. Somewhere in the house, a door closed. Somewhere, a servant coughed. The pianoforte was silent now. Tabitha listened to the shape of the silence and knew that Cassandra had gone up to her afternoon rest, that Lady Hyacinth had gone into the small parlor to write her letters, that Lord Arthur was at his club in St. James's Street, that the housekeeper was in the still room with the second housemaid, that the kitchen was between meals. The house was as empty of watchers as it ever was. Tabitha set down her needle. She reached to the small wooden box beside the candle, in which she kept her thimbles and her pins, and took from beneath the tray of pins a folded sheet of the Morning Post, 3 days old, that she had rescued from the fire in the breakfast room when Lord Arthur had thrown it aside. She smoothed it upon the table. She had not yet had leisure to read it. She would read it now, quickly, before the light failed. But first, she looked at the door. She listened. Nothing. Then she took up her needle and drew it, quickly and precisely, along a certain seam in the lining of her own bodice. 3 stitches parted. The stitches were her own, sewn each morning after she dressed, cut each afternoon when she was alone. She had done it every day for 4 years. From the little pocket that opened in the lining she drew out, with 2 fingertips, a heavy gold ring. It lay upon her palm, warm from the heat of her body. The gold was old and soft and darkened at the edges from long wearing. The bezel was flat and oval, engraved with a boar rampant and 3 stars above, the arms of the Viscounts Harcourt of Ravenhill, granted by King James I in the year 1611. It had been her father's. Before him, her grandfather's. Before him, 7 generations of Harcourt men had signed their letters with the impress of that boar and those 3 stars. It was the last thing she owned that had been her father's. She did not put it on. She never put it on. She looked at it for 2 seconds by the count of her own pulse, and then she folded her fingers over it and closed her eyes. "I am Tabitha Harcourt of Ravenhill," she said, without moving her lips. "I am the daughter of Viscount Harcourt. I am not Mrs. Vale. I am not a scarecrow. I am not a stump. I am not 6 pence at the end of a quarter. I am Tabitha Harcourt of Ravenhill, and my father was a good man, and my house was an old house, and I have not forgotten who I am." She opened her eyes. She lifted her fingers. The ring lay warm on her palm. She slid it back into its pocket in the lining of her bodice. She threaded her needle. She sewed the seam shut with 3 quick, invisible stitches, and bit off the thread, and tied off the end within the seam so that no knot showed. She smoothed her bodice. She took up the newspaper. The Morning Post crackled faintly beneath her fingers. Its columns were dense with the small, dark type of the day. Court news, ship arrivals, deaths, births, notices from the marriage market, advertisements for tooth powder and Warren's blacking. She scanned quickly. She had trained herself to scan. She had trained herself to look for 2 words only when she looked at any paper: Harcourt and Ravenhill, because the family name and the family seat were the 2 axles upon which her life had once turned, and she could not stop herself from looking, though she had not seen either printed in 4 years. She did not find them today either. She was about to fold the paper and hide it beneath the pin tray when her eye caught, in the 3rd column, a single notice set apart in a square black rule. Wanted. A gentlewoman of impeccable character and superior accomplishments, to serve as governess to 2 young ladies aged 9 and 7 in the household of the Earl of Bramwell. Salary double the customary rate. Applicant must possess French, Italian, drawing, the rudiments of Latin, and a proficiency in the pianoforte. Widows preferred. Written applications, in the applicant's own hand, to be delivered under seal to M.R. Augustus Strickland, solicitor, number 14 Lincoln's Inn Fields, before Friday next. Tabitha read the notice through twice. She read it a 3rd time. The Earl of Bramwell. The name touched her as a bell might touch a still glass. Bramwell. Marbury. The ice lord of the papers. Of the caricatures at Ackerman's window. Of the whispered gossip in Lady Hyacinth's parlor. Marcus Marbury, 7th Earl of Bramwell, 34 years of age, a peninsular officer decorated at Badajoz, a bachelor of great fortune and colder manner, said to have neither friend nor confidant, said to keep his 2 orphaned half-sisters at Bramwell Park, and to speak to no one at all when he came up to London for the session. She had never met him. She was almost certain of that. Almost. She frowned. Somewhere at the back of her memory, in the childhood parts of it that were kept in a room she did not often enter, there stirred a small ghost. A boy of perhaps 15, dark-haired, thin, standing very upright in the drawing-room at Ravenhill, in a boy's coat. Her mother pressing a small leather book into his hands. A book of pressed roses. He had bowed. He had not smiled. He had said, in a voice already low for his age, "I shall not forget your kindness, madam." She had been 6 years old. She had wondered why he did not smile. She could not have sworn that this boy was the ice lord of the Morning Post, but she could not have sworn that he was not. She looked again at the notice. Salary double the customary rate. She thought of the 6pence docked from her quarter. She thought of the boots wearing thin at the sole. She thought of the ring, warm now against her ribs, and of the 7 generations of Harcourt men who had signed their letters with the impress of the boar and the 3 stars. She thought of her father's grave in the Ravenhill churchyard, over which she had not been permitted to lay a stone. She rose. She crossed to the deal table beneath the window. She took down the small tin box in which she kept her few possessions: 3 handkerchiefs, a testament, a lock of her mother's hair, a stub of pencil, and a small sheaf of writing paper, cheap and thin, that she had bought a quire at a time from a stationer in Long Acre. She took out a single sheet. She sharpened her pencil. She reconsidered the pencil and set it aside, and took instead the small bottle of ink and the goose quill she had trimmed the week before. She sat. She looked at the paper. She thought for a long moment, longer than her ordinary decisions took. Then she wrote, in the round, careful hand she had been taught at 10 years old. To Mr. Augustus Strickland, solicitor, number 14 Lincoln's Inn Fields. Sir, I beg leave to offer myself as a candidate for the post of governess, advertised this week in the Morning Post, in the household of the Right Honourable the Earl of Bramwell. I am a widow of 22, of English birth and Christian upbringing, in possession of French, Italian, the rudiments of Latin, drawing in pencil and watercolor, and the pianoforte. I have some knowledge of the cultivation of roses. I can furnish no personal references, having lately lost the small family upon whom I depended, but I can offer my own character to your inspection, and would be prepared to travel to any address you might name for that purpose. I remain, sir, your most obedient servant, Monsieur Vale. She read the letter through. She read it again. She hesitated at the phrase, having lately lost the small family upon whom I depended, which was neither wholly a lie nor wholly a truth, and then she left it. She hesitated at the signature. M. Vale, not Tabitha, not Harcourt. She dipped the quill again and signed. She dried the ink with a little sand. She folded the letter into thirds, then into thirds again. She took from the box a stub of red sealing wax and held it to the candle. A drop fell, and she pressed it flat with the back of her thumb. She did not have a seal. She thought, for the briefest of instants, of the ring in her bodice, the boar and the 3 stars. It would have taken her 2 seconds to draw it out, press it into the wax, and seal her application with the seal of the Viscounts Harcourt of Ravenhill. She did not. She smoothed the wax flat with her thumb and let it cool. Let the letter carry no arms but her own bare fingerprint. Let Mrs. Vale be Mrs. Vale. She wrote the direction upon the outside, blew upon it, and slipped the letter into the pocket of her apron. She would find a way to post it before dark. There was a boy at the corner of Bruton Street who would take a letter for a farthing, and she had, hidden in the toe of her Sunday stocking, exactly 7 farthings. She rose. The candle guttered, and she pinched it out between finger and thumb without flinching. In the sudden gray of the attic she stood a moment, feeling the outline of the ring against her ribs, and the outline of the letter in her apron, and the outline of the 6pence that would not be paid to her. She smoothed her skirt. She took up the pink gown. She went down the attic stair with her back straight, her chin level, and the letter to Mr. Strickland folded flat against her heart. The house of Bertie, at that hour, was going through the small commotion of the afternoon. Molly the housemaid was carrying a jug of hot water up the front stair. In the small parlor, Lady Hyacinth had begun her afternoon letters at a rosewood escritoire. She held her pen aloft as Tabitha passed the parlor door, and glanced at her, and let her pass without comment. In the morning room, Cassandra had risen from her rest and was picking at a plate of cold chicken with an air of grievance. Tabitha went on, through the green baize door, down the service stair, into the passage that led to the kitchen and thence to the mews. In the mews, she did not go into the stable. She turned left, along the narrow alley, and came out into Bruton Street beside the corner of a milliner's shop where a boy of 10 stood shivering in a coat too thin for him, with a bundle of unsold broadsides under his arm. Tommy. He knew her. She had given him a farthing twice a week for 4 months. Mrs. Vale, ma'am. Take this letter. She pressed it into his red hand. To Lincoln's Inn Fields, number 14. Mr. Augustus Strickland, solicitor. Into his own hand if you can. Into the hand of his clerk if you cannot. She placed 2 farthings in his palm. 1 for the going, she said, and 1 for the coming back to tell me it was done. Yes, Mrs. Vale, ma'am. He touched the brim of his cap. He turned. He ran, weaving between a passing dray and a nursemaid pushing a bath chair. Tabitha watched him until he turned into Berkeley Square and vanished. The snow had begun again, small and dry as sifted sugar. She stood on the corner of Bruton Street in her thin boots, and the flakes caught in her lashes, and she did not blink them away for a long moment. She had done a thing. For 4 years she had done nothing but survive. She had taken the situations that were offered. She had accepted the wages that were pressed upon her. She had lowered her eyes when told to lower them, and lifted them when told to lift them, and answered to a name that was not hers, and slept in attics colder than the one she had just left, and eaten food that was cooler than her master's, and folded her hands upon her lap in parlors, where her mother had once been received as an equal. She had survived, and she had told herself, each morning as she stitched the ring back into her bodice, that survival was itself a kind of loyalty to the dead. But survival, she saw now, standing at the corner of Bruton Street with snow on her lashes, was only the shape a life took when it had not yet chosen. Today, at last, she had chosen. She had done it without asking permission. She had done it without confessing her name. She had done it without knowing whether the boy she half remembered from Ravenhill drawing room was the man who now advertised for a governess in Grosvenor Square. She had done it because 6pence had been docked from her quarter, and because a girl 3 years her junior had called her a scarecrow, and because the ring against her ribs was still warm, and because a woman who did not act was a woman who was acted upon, and because she was Tabitha Harcourt of Ravenhill, and Tabitha Harcourt of Ravenhill was not finished yet. She turned. She went back through the mews, through the kitchen passage, up the service stair, through the green baize door. Nobody had missed her. In the small parlor, Lady Hyacinth's pen scratched steadily. In the morning room, Cassandra pushed the cold chicken away and called for tea. In the attic, the candle was cold, and the pink silk gown lay unfinished across the deal table, and the small red drop of sealing wax lay unused beside the pin tray, a bright bead of color in the gray. Tabitha lit a fresh candle from the coals. She took up her needle. She bent again to the gown. The clock in the hall below struck 3. The needle went in. The needle came out. Somewhere across Mayfair, at that same moment, a footman in the mulberry livery of the Earl of Bramwell was passing between the columns of a Palladian portico in Grosvenor Square, with a silver salver in his hand and a small sealed letter upon it, addressed in a solicitor's copperplate to his master. He did not yet know that another letter, folded flat and sealed with a bare fingerprint, was even then traveling east through the falling snow toward Lincoln's Inn Fields, in the pocket of a boy who ran because a lady had given him a farthing and looked him in the eye as though he were a person. Tabitha did not know it either. She only knew that her needle went in, and her needle came out, and that under the pink silk of Cassandra Bertie's ball gown, hidden against her ribs beneath 3 quick stitches, the boar and the 3 stars of the Viscounts Harcourt of Ravenhill lay warm and waiting and unbroken. The morning post came into the Bertie house at 9:30, folded and warm from the printer's boy, and Lord Arthur left it on the breakfast table beside a plate of cold ham he would not finish. He rose, coughed twice, and wandered off toward his brandy. The paper lay open at page 4. Tabitha had been carrying up the coal scuttle for the drawing-room grate. She set it down. She had not eaten. She was not permitted to sit at that table. But the paper was there, and the room was empty, and she had learned, in 3 years under this roof, to read a newspaper very quickly while standing. Her eyes moved down the column of advertisements. Governesses wanted, companions wanted, a widow of quiet habits sought as reader to a dowager in Bath. And then, 3 lines from the bottom, in a plainer type than the rest, as if the man who placed it had refused to pay for ornament. Wanted, a governess of good education and steady character, for 2 young wards of the Earl of Bramwell. Terms twice the usual. Inquiries in writing only, to Mr. A. Strickland, solicitor, Lincoln's Inn. Tabitha read it once, then again. The coal scuttle at her feet ticked as a lump settled inside it. Twice the usual. She knew what the usual was. £25 a year for a governess who could teach French, drawing, and the harp. The dowager in Marylebone, who had turned her away in November, had offered 18. Twice the usual meant 50. £50 a year meant, after 2 years, a passage. After 3, a small house near a school, where a girl might teach music and never once be called a scarecrow. She heard Lady Hyacinth's foot on the stair. Tabitha lifted the coal scuttle, carried it to the grate, tipped it in with the practiced turn of the wrist that spilled nothing, and went out by the servant's door with the empty scuttle against her hip. She did not look at the newspaper again. She did not need to. She had the words already. By dusk that day she had written the letter. She wrote it in the little box room above the pantry that Lady Hyacinth allowed her, on a half sheet of paper cut from the back of a discarded music copybook, with ink she had mixed thinner than the household kept, because the household ink was measured. She wrote in the smallest, most level hand she owned, the hand her mother had taught her before her mother died, when a lady's letter was still expected to be beautiful. Sir, I am a widow of 22, without children, in reduced circumstances. I read French and Italian, write a fair Latin, play upon the pianoforte and the harp, and have some skill with watercolor and with the rearing of roses. I have been for 3 years in a private situation in London, which I may leave upon a fortnight's notice, and for which a character may be applied for, though I would beg the Earl's discretion in the enquiry. I should be honored to be considered for the situation of governess to his 2 young wards. I am, sir, your obedient servant, Mrs. M. Vale, 14 Half Moon Street, Mayfair. She signed it Mrs. M. Vale, as she had signed everything since she was 19. The M was for nothing. There had never been a Mr. Vale. Vale was the name of a valley behind Ravenhill where she had ridden as a child. She had chosen it in a Dover coaching inn the morning her father was buried by strangers. She sealed it with plain black wax pressed with the flat of her thumbnail. No crest, no cipher, nothing that could be traced. She addressed it to Mr. A. Strickland, solicitor, Lincoln's Inn. Then she sat still on the edge of the truckle bed for a long moment, the letter in her lap, and asked herself whether she truly meant to do it. The Earl of Bramwell, the Ice Lord. The papers wrote of him as if he were a weather condition. She had seen him once, from a window on Piccadilly, dismounting from a black gelding outside White's, a tall figure in a dark coat, and the crowd on the pavement had made a channel for him without anyone speaking. She had drawn back from the glass at the time. She was not, then or now, the sort of woman who ought to write to such a house, except that she had another name folded inside the lining of her stays, and it was tired of being folded. She rose, put on her bonnet, took the letter down the back stairs, and gave it to the crossing sweeper's boy at the corner of Curzon Street, with a farthing to carry it to the 2-penny post before the last collection. She watched him run. She watched the letter go out of her hand as a person watches a small boat leave a shore. Then she walked back to the house, took up the mending basket, and set 6 neat stitches into the hem of Cassandra Birdie's morning gown, before Cassandra came down to complain that her chocolate was cold. The letter reached Lincoln's Inn the next morning by the 10 o'clock delivery. Mr. Augustus Strickland, solicitor to the Earl of Bramwell for 32 years, sat at his desk in his narrow chambers off New Square, with a fire that gave off more smoke than heat, and a cat asleep on his blotter. He was a spare, upright man of 58, with white hair combed carefully back over a high forehead, and small steel spectacles that he pushed up his nose when he thought. He had answered 25 applications for the situation in 3 days. He had shown none of them to the Earl. The Earl had been very particular. Strickland was to filter, and to bring only such letters as, in his own judgment, were not vulgar, not desperate in the writing, and not written by a woman who used the word charming about children she had not met. He slit Mrs. Vale's letter with the ivory paper knife his own father had left him. He read it once, he read it again more slowly. He set his spectacles down on the desk, The hand was extraordinary. It was not merely fair, it was formed. Every letter sat on the line as if it had been ruled there. The loops were small, disciplined, unshowy. It was the hand of a girl who had been taught to write by someone who had also been taught to write, and taught well. A hand out of a schoolroom of the last century, when a young lady's copybook was still made her by her mother from ruled paper and gall ink. And the letter itself was without a single unnecessary word. She did not describe herself, she did not plead. She said what she could do, she said what she asked. She signed her name. She had even had the sense, and the pride, to ask for discretion in the character. Strickland turned the letter over in his hand. The seal was plain wax, without device. That, too, told him something. Most widows of 22 in reduced circumstances used whatever crest they had once been entitled to. This one had chosen not to. He put on his hat, folded the letter into his inside pocket, and walked to Grosvenor Square. Bramwell House stood at the northwest corner, the third door from the corner, with 2 black-painted iron torches by the steps, and no ornament on the door but the number and the polished brass knocker in the shape of a wolf's head. The Bramwell wolf, not the boar of Ravenhill. It was a house that told you nothing. Bagshot opened the door. Bagshot was the butler. Bagshot had opened doors in this house for 19 years, and would not, if pressed, have admitted that his master ever received callers. He admitted Strickland into the small book-lined anteroom off the hall, where a fire had been laid but not lit, because his master was not in the habit of warming rooms he was not sitting in, and went upstairs. Strickland waited 9 minutes. He had timed this walk many times. Then Bagshot returned and said, "His lordship will see you now, sir," in the library. The library at Bramwell House was 2 stories tall, with a gallery running round it at the level of the first floor, and a ladder on rails for the upper shelves. The books were arranged, as everything in the Earl's houses was arranged, without any concession to display. Vellum spines faced the wall to save the gilding. Small labels in Strickland's own hand told the servants what stood where. A single lamp burned on the great writing table under the south window, and the fire in the marble grate had been built up to a working heat, because in this room, at least, his lordship was in the habit of sitting. Marcus Marbury, 7th Earl of Bramwell, stood at the window with his back to the door. He was in his shirt sleeves, which meant he had been up early, which meant he had been up all night. The shirt was very white against the grey light. His coat, black superfine, lay across the back of a chair with the mathematical knot of the cravat still holding. His hair, black and cut close on the sides and a little longer at the front, was undisturbed. He turned as Strickland came in, and Strickland, who had known him since he was a boy of 11, pulled home from Eton to bury his father, still felt, at the age of 58, the small deliberate cooling of the room around this man. "Strickland, my lord, sit." The Earl did not sit. He stood at the mantel and rested one hand on it. The fire caught the saber scar that ran through the outer end of his right eyebrow and made a thin, bright line of it. He inclined his head very slightly to the right, as he always did when he wished to hear clearly. Badajoz had taken the sharpness out of his left ear in the summer of 1812, and he had never got it back. Strickland had learnt, in the years since, to sit on his master's right. "You have brought letters." "I have brought one." The Earl's grey eyes went to Strickland's face, held there, moved to the inside pocket of the solicitor's coat. "One only, of the 25. "Of the 26, my lord. The last came this morning. It is the one I have brought." "Then read it." Strickland took the letter out, unfolded it on his knee, cleared his throat once, and read it aloud. He read in the flat, impersonal voice he had cultivated for the reading of leases and marriage settlements. He did not color a word. He gave her Mrs. M. Vale, 14 Half Moon Street, Mayfair, at the end without emphasis, folded the paper, and set it down on the low table between them. The Earl did not speak. He crossed the hearthrug in 3 strides, picked the letter up, and turned it toward the lamp on the writing table. He did not sit. He held it under the lamp with both hands, one at the top of the sheet and one at the bottom, and read it himself. Read it slowly, the way a man reads a document upon which money is turning. And Strickland, who had known his lordship since childhood, watched something happen in his lordship's face that Strickland had not seen happen in 25 years. It was very small. A muscle at the corner of the jaw pulled once. The line of the mouth changed by perhaps the breadth of a hair. The gray eyes stopped moving down the page and rested on the signature. Mrs. M. Vale. The Earl set the letter down flat on the writing table. He placed the tip of his right forefinger upon the signature, not on the name, but on the small, careful loop of the V, and left it there. Strickland. My lord. Where did you say this came from? Half Moon Street, my lord. The Bertie House. The Bertie House. Lord Arthur Bertie, Lady Hyacinth, a daughter of 19. The address is theirs. The Earl was silent. The finger did not move from the V. You know this hand, Strickland said, not as a question. He had been 32 years a solicitor to this family. He had learnt when to move a small piece of information into the open air and when to leave it under the table. He judged, this once, to move it. I know this hand. May I ask, my lord? You may not. The Earl lifted his finger. He turned from the table and walked once to the window and back. He did not look at Strickland. He was, Strickland understood, considering not the letter but the last 10 years, and how much of them lay under it. He had been a boy of 24, in the summer of 1808, sitting in his mother's morning room at Bramwell Park with a foot in plaster from a hunting fall, when a smaller boy in tow of a governess had come in with a copybook full of receipts for the making of a tar of roses, receipts of no interest to a young man with a broken ankle, except that the small hand in which they had been copied was, even then, formed. That boy in tow of a governess had been, as Marbury remembered now with perfect clarity, a girl of 12 in a plain gray riding habit, red hair coming out of a plait, freckles across the bridge of her nose, sea-green eyes that met his over the top of the copybook without looking down. She had brought the book because his mother had asked her mother for the receipt, and because her mother, the Viscountess of Ravenhill, was too ill that week to bring it herself. The girl had bowed like a boy, laid the book on the table, waited to be dismissed, and gone. He had not spoken to her. He had watched her out of the room. He had gone back to his letter. He had seen her twice more that summer, at a distance, at his mother's picnic, and once on the ride between Ravenhill and Bramwell, a red-haired child on a gray pony, alone, with a bunch of dog roses across the saddle. He had lifted his hat, she had inclined her head, that was the whole of it. 2 years later her father, John Harcourt, 6th Viscount Ravenhill, had been ruined in a South American mining scheme managed, on paper, by a man named Bertie. 2 years after that Ravenhill had died at sea on a passage to Lisbon of a fever, alone. The girl was said to have gone to a cousin in Yorkshire. The estate was sold. The barony was declared extinct by a college of arms too tired to look for the female line. Marbury, then a captain in the peninsula with a scar new on his brow and a deaf ear new to him, had read of the death in a 3-month-old English paper on the road to Salamanca and had said aloud, to no one, that is a piece of injustice. He had meant to attend to it when the war was done. The war had not been done for 6 more years. And when it was done, he had come home to a title, an infant mother-dead half-sister called Felicity, an infant father-dead half-sister called Jemima, a fortune enlarged by 2 coalfields and a shipping line, a parliamentary seat, and a country to which the Viscount of Ravenhill was a name in a footnote. He had made inquiries. The cousin in Yorkshire had, it appeared, sold the girl on to a Mayfair household as a companion. He had lost her trail there. He had put a man on it in the November of the year before last. The man had reported, in January, that a red-haired young woman of the right age was in the Bertie House on Half Moon Street under the name of Mrs. Vale, unpaid, kept as a seamstress and companion, and would not speak of her family to anyone. He had not moved then. He had thought, and had been right to think, that a man in his position could not simply drive to a house in Mayfair and lift a young woman out of it. The world would have made her into something in a week. He had thought further. He had spoken to no one but Strickland, and to Strickland only in fragments. He had, in November of that year, gone quietly to Carlton House. The Regent had signed what was set before him, because the Regent signed what men like Marbury set before him. In a locked drawer of this writing table, 3 feet from Marbury's right hand as he stood, lay letters patent under the Great Seal, restoring the Viscounty of Ravenhill in favor of the only surviving heir of the body of John Harcourt, 6th Viscount, namely, Tabitha Adelaide Harcourt, spinster, of full age. It had lain in that drawer since the 16th of November. He had not opened it since. He had needed, only, for her to come to him. He had put the advertisement in the post because it was the one door in London a girl in her position might reach for on her own. He had not expected her to reach. He had expected to have to open the door in the end himself, and to bear whatever she thought of him for it. Now, on his writing table, in a hand he had watched cross a copybook when he was 24 and she was 12, lay the words, Mrs. M. Vale, 14 Half Moon Street, Mayfair. She had come to the door herself. He straightened. Strickland. My lord, you will write to Mrs. Vale by hand of my own footman this hour. You will summon her here for interview at 11:30 tomorrow morning. You will send a hackney to Half Moon Street at 11, not one of my carriages, and pay the driver in advance to wait and to return her. You will not name me in the letter. You will sign only your own name. You will say the interview is at the house of a client, nothing more. Yes, my lord. If she asks the servant the name of the house, the servant will not know it. The knocker will be muffled. You will meet her in the hall yourself, take her to the small library, and leave. I will come down. Yes, my lord. One further thing. My lord. You will not, tomorrow or hereafter, address her by any name but the name she has given, Mrs. Vale, until she gives me another herself. Strickland inclined his head. He had been in this family long enough to know when he was being asked to hold a thing quietly, and he held it. He rose to go. At the door he paused, because he was a man who had earned, over 33 years, the right to one small question, and he judged this the day for it. My lord, is the young woman known to your lordship? The earl was again at the window. The grey light lay flat on the side of his face, and the sabre scar caught it. She copied a receipt for my mother, once, he said. In the summer of the year 8, she was 12. Her father was ruined by a man called Bertie 2 years afterwards. She has been in Bertie's house, unpaid, for 3 years. You will now understand, Strickland, why the advertisement was placed. Strickland understood. He said, Yes, my lord, and went out. The earl stood a long moment at the window when the door had closed. He did not move. Grosvenor Square below him was a grey rectangle of railings and thin March sun, and a nursemaid pushing a perambulator round the plane trees. In his ear, the good ear, there was the small, clean sound of Strickland's shoes going down the outer stair. He turned back to the letter. He picked it up, folded it once along the crease she had made, and carried it to a small ebony cabinet, inlaid with brass beside the fireplace. He unlocked the cabinet with a key he wore on a plain steel chain about his neck under his shirt. Inside lay a folded document tied with pink tape and sealed with red wax the size of a crown piece. The Regent's seal, unbroken. He laid the letter of Mrs. M. Vale on top of the letter's patent, side by side, the little plain black thumbprint of wax, and the great red seal of the Prince Regent, and closed the cabinet, and locked it, and put the chain back under his shirt. Then he rang for Bagshot, and asked for coffee, and sat down at the writing table, and drew toward him a fresh sheet, and began, in his own hand, a hard, upright, soldier's hand, to write out 3 questions in French, 1 in Latin, and a 4th, in English, on the pruning of roses. At number 14 Half Moon Street that same afternoon, Tabitha was sent up to the linen room to count out sheets for the laundress. She had been sent there because Lady Hyacinth wished the drawing-room clear for a visitor, and did not wish the widow to be seen. She counted the sheets. She refolded 3 that had been folded wrong. She sat down on the edge of the linen chest and, for a moment, closed her eyes. She had heard nothing. She could not, in reason, have expected to hear anything so soon. A letter posted at dusk on Tuesday would not, even in London, be answered by Thursday afternoon. And Lincoln's Inn was slow. Solicitors were slow. Gentlemen of great houses were slower. She had told herself all of this on the walk back from the corner of Curzon Street, and again on the stairs, and again while she stitched Cassandra's hem. It made no difference. Something in her, some small unfamiliar thing under the ribs, was listening for a knock at the front door that was not for the Birdies. At 4 o'clock the knock came. Tabitha, in the linen room 2 floors above, did not hear it. She heard, some minutes later, Cassandra's footman running up the back stairs 2 at a time and calling for her by the wrong name. Mrs. Vale, Mrs. Vale, there's a footman below with a letter for you, and he's a proper footman, and he won't give it to no one but yourself. And Tabitha rose, smoothed her apron, and went down. In the servants' hall stood a footman in a plain dark livery she did not recognize, tall, gloved, and expressionless. He held out a folded sheet with a plain wafer of black wax. "Mrs. Vale? I am Mrs. Vale. With Mr. Strickland's compliments, ma'am. I am to wait for no answer." He bowed, turned, and went out through the area door. The birdie footman stared after him. The cook stared. The scullery maid dropped a spoon. Tabitha slid the letter into the cuff of her sleeve and walked, without hurrying, up the back stairs to the box room over the pantry, and closed the door, and sat down on the truckle bed, and only then broke the seal. "Madam, I am directed by a client of this firm to invite you to attend at his house tomorrow, Friday, at 11:30, for the purpose of an interview upon the situation of governess, advertised in these terms. A hackney will call at Half Moon Street at 11 o'clock and convey you thither and back. You are asked to name the situation to no person of the house at which you presently reside. The knocker will be muffled, and the servant at the door will not name his master. Your obedient servant, A. Strickland." She read it twice. The second time she read it, she noticed that her hands were steady and her breath was not. That was interesting. She had thought it would be the other way. She refolded the letter, slid it into the lining of her stays beside the ring, and went back down to finish counting the sheets. That evening at dinner, Lady Hyacinth remarked, over the second course, that a hackney had been at the door in the afternoon, and that no one in the house had ordered it, and that she trusted, in an unpleasant tone, which did not require an answer, that none of her people had begun to receive callers of their own. Cassandra laughed. Lord Arthur said nothing, being asleep behind his glass. Tabitha, standing at the sideboard to change the plates, kept her eyes on her hands and said, "No, my lady, that was true. She had received no caller. She had received only a footman in livery, and he had not stayed." At 9:30 she was dismissed to her room. At 10 she took the letter out, read it again by the stump of a tallow candle, and set it under her pillow. At 11 she blew out the candle. At 11:30, in the dark, she took the ring out of the lining of her stays and held it in her closed hand under her cheek, and thought of a red seal she had never seen, and a house in Grosvenor Square she had walked past once, 3 years ago, from the top of an omnibus, and had looked up at, and had looked away from, because it had seemed to her then that houses like that were not to do with her, and never would be again. Tomorrow, at 11:30, she would step out of a hackney at a door she did not know, and a servant who would not tell her the name of his master would show her into a small library, and a man she did not know would come down, and would ask her a question in French, and another in Latin, and one, finally, about the pruning of roses. And under the pink silk of Cassandra Bertie's ball gown, in a wardrobe 2 floors below her, the boar and the 3 stars of Ravenhill still lay stitched against the ribs of a dress that was not hers, waiting for a hand to cut the stitches out. The hackney stopped at the corner of Grosvenor Square at 10:09. Tabitha Harcourt paid the driver the full fare because she did not intend to give any man in London a reason to remember her face for the wrong sum. She stepped down onto stone slick with frost. She did not walk directly to the house. She walked the long side of the square first, counting doors under her breath, so that she would arrive at Bramwell House with the composure of a woman turning in from an errand, and not the composure of a woman who had lain awake since 3 in the morning staring at a folded newspaper. Bramwell House sat behind a forecourt of black and white marble. The door was black lacquer. The knocker was a bronze boar's head with 3 small stars beaten into the plate above it. Tabitha's gloved hand paused in the air a half-breath before she let it fall. Her father's charge, and her mother's rose garden, on a knocker she had never seen, belonging to a man whose name she had known since she was a child at the copying desk. The footman opened before she could knock a second time. "Mrs. Vale," she said, and gave a small, exact curtsy, "for the 11 o'clock appointment with his lordship." "You are early, madam." "I prefer to be." He inclined his head and stepped aside. She crossed the threshold and was inside Bramwell House, and the door shut behind her with the low, dense sound of a very heavy door well hung. The entrance hall smelled of beeswax and cold marble. The porter took her cloak. She kept her bonnet on. It allowed her to lower her face into shadow whenever a servant crossed her line of sight. A housekeeper came down the stairs. 60s, black wool, apron starched to the sheen of a new prayer book, keys chiming at her waist. Her eyes lifted to Tabitha's face and stopped. They stopped, and they stayed. For 1 heartbeat, then 2, the housekeeper did not move. Her mouth parted. Her hand went, without her willing it, to the crucifix at her throat. "Mrs. Vale?" she said, and her voice was even, and it was the evenness of a woman biting the inside of her cheek. "Yes, I am Mrs. Penhaligon, his lordship's housekeeper." A pause. "Will you follow me?" She led Tabitha across the hall to a small anteroom and gestured to a straight chair by the fire. She did not offer tea. She stood in the doorway a moment longer than a housekeeper ought. "Have we met before, madam?" she asked at last, and the question came out flat, the way a woman practices flatness when the truth of a question could ruin two lives. "I do not believe so," Tabitha said. Mrs. Penhaligon looked at her for one further beat. Then she inclined her head as one inclines it to a person one has decided to protect. "His lordship will see you at 11, not before. He is particular about the hour." She closed the door. Tabitha sat by the fire. She kept her hands folded in her lap, one thumb pressed into the palm of the other. Mrs. Penhaligon had been at Ravenhill in the summer of 1808. A cheerful under-housekeeper called Marigold, who had once let a small red-haired girl churn butter and smuggled her a bruised strawberry. Ravenhill had thought her lost when she married North. She had not been lost. She had been in the Earl of Bramwell's household, keeping his keys. She has recognized me, and she has said nothing. At 3 minutes past 11, a bell rang somewhere behind the wall. Mrs. Penhaligon appeared at the door and lifted her chin. "His lordship will see you now." Tabitha rose. She smoothed the front of her wool skirt with 2 brief passes of her hand, which was less about the skirt than about the tremor she wished to press out of her fingers. She followed Mrs. Penhaligon along a corridor hung with framed battlefield maps. Salamanca, Vittoria, Badajoz, each marked in a precise hand with a date. A man who kept his own battles pinned to his corridor was a man still fighting them. Mrs. Penhaligon stopped at a pair of double doors of dark oak, laid a hand on each brass handle, and pushed them inward. "Mrs. Vale, my lord." Tabitha stepped inside, and the doors closed behind her. The library ran the full depth of the west wing. 2 stories of dark bookcases climbed to a gallery. A fire burned low. Behind a great mahogany desk stood a man. She had prepared herself for the Earl of Bramwell the way one prepares for weather. She had not prepared herself for this. He was very tall. His shoulders filled the black Weston coat without padding. His hair was black. His eyes were a pale gray, the color of a sword blade after use. A thin scar ran through his right eyebrow. He did not smile. He stood with one hand on the corner of the desk and looked at her with the still, unhurried attention of a man who has learned that most things reveal themselves if one waits. She curtsied, correctly, not deep. "My lord." "Mrs. Vale." His voice was low, and he inclined his head half an inch to the left before she finished the curtsy. He tilted the good ear toward her. "Badajoz." She filed it away. "Please sit." She sat. He walked around the desk to a side table, closed a bound volume, and only then took the chair opposite her. He set his hands flat on the desk. A signet ring caught the light on the smallest finger of the left hand. "You are Mrs. Vale," he said. "I am, my lord." "You are a widow." "Yes." "How long?" 2 years, my lord." "Your husband was—" "A curate, in Somerset. He died of a fever the winter before last." She had rehearsed them so often on the walk that they came out with the flat cadence of truth, which was, she noted, the same cadence as a well-made lie. He did not blink. "And what brought you to London?" "Necessity." He almost smiled. Not quite. One corner of his mouth acknowledged the answer and then relinquished it. "Very well. I have questions, Mrs. Vale. If you will forgive me. The position I offer is not an ordinary one, and I do not care to waste either of our mornings." "Please, my lord." He took up a small sheet of paper from the desk. She saw that he did not read it. He had committed it to memory. "Vous aimez les enfants, Madame Val?" The French was a Parisian French, refined, unaccented. She answered without pause. "Je les aime, monsieur, quand il me le permet." He inclined his head. He continued, still in French. "How would you comfort a child of 7 who wakes at night and cannot say what she has dreamed?" "I would light the candle first, my lord. Then I would put her hand in mine and tell her a story of something small and ordinary. A cat crossing a garden wall, a cook stealing an apple. When the small thing is more real than the dream, she can go back to sleep." "And a child of 9 who refuses to eat?" I would eat beside her without speaking of it, my lord, for 3 days if necessary. Children come to bread more easily than they come to persuasion. He set the paper down. Latin, Mrs. Vale. Rem tene, verba sequentur. Hold to the matter, and the words will follow, my lord. Cato the Elder. It is the answer to almost every problem of a governess. Now the corner of his mouth moved a second time, and did not entirely relinquish it. He rose. He crossed to the tall window and stood a moment looking out at the plane trees, one hand at his back, the other flat on the sill. Then he turned and asked, still looking at the window, "How does one prune a damask rose in the 2nd year, madam, so that it will flower in the 3rd?" The question landed like a hand laid flat on the top of her head. She had helped her mother prune the damask roses of Ravenhill in their 2nd year. She had watched her mother measure the 3rd leaf and set the shears above it at an angle. She had copied that lesson into a fair book bound in green ribbon and sent it to the Dowager Countess of Bramwell in 1808, in a child's slightly wavering hand. Tabitha did not permit her face to move. "One cuts to an outward-facing bud, above the 3rd leaf from the base, my lord, at a slant, in the last week of February. One does not cut in autumn, though many gardeners will tell you otherwise, and one does not water the crown in the year of the cut." He turned from the window. He was looking at her with the particular quiet of a man who has just been answered in his own private language by a stranger. "Thank you, Mrs. Vale," he said. He came back to the desk. He did not sit at once. He stood behind his chair, both hands resting on the top rail, and considered her over the length of the mahogany. "You will forgive the peculiarity of the last question. I asked it because I had reason to. Your other answers were satisfactory. That one was correct." Something in the way he said correct was not the correctness of a governess's reply. "I am glad to have satisfied, my lord." "You have more than satisfied." He sat. "I will be plain, Mrs. Vale. My 2 wards are Miss Felicity, aged 9, and Miss Jemima, aged 7. Their father, my cousin, drowned at sea. Their mother followed him 3 months after. They have had 4 governesses in 15 months. 3 left because they could not endure the silence. 1 left because Miss Felicity locked her in the linen cupboard for the space of an afternoon." Tabitha's mouth did not move, but her eyes did. He saw it. "I did not dismiss her," he said. "She dismissed herself. Miss Felicity was not punished. I asked her only whether she would prefer another governess. She said she would prefer a woman who had lost something. I did not, at the time, entirely understand her." He paused. "I believe I understand her now." Tabitha kept her hands folded in her lap. "The position pays £120 a year," he continued. 2 half-days a week to yourself, a bedchamber on the 1st floor adjoining the schoolroom, your keep at my board. A woman comes for your linen. In the summer we remove to Bramwell Park, in Lincolnshire. You will be expected to travel with the household. I will require your answer today. I do not care to interview again." £120 a year was double the highest salary paid to a governess in London. It was almost precisely double. "My lord," she said, and her voice was steady, "may I ask why you offer twice the ordinary sum?" He looked at her a long moment. "Because my sisters," he said, and she noted the word sisters, not wards, though he had said wards a breath before, "require a woman who has already lost everything and has not surrendered to it. Such women are rare. When one presents herself, I do not haggle." The silence between them lengthened. Outside, a carriage passed. A footman coughed once in the corridor. The fire settled. "I accept, my lord," Tabitha said. "Good." He took up a pen. He wrote 3 lines in a hand so exact it looked engraved. He blotted them, folded the sheet once, and pushed it across the desk to her. "The terms," he said. "You will sign the fair copy tomorrow, when Mr. Strickland has drawn it. This is only my hand." She read the 3 lines. He had written the salary, the removal to Lincolnshire in June, and 1 further line beneath in a smaller hand. "In the event of any grievance whatsoever within this household, Mrs. Vale is to apply directly and only to the Earl of Bramwell. She is to answer to no other authority in this house." She looked up. "My lord, this is necessary," he said. He did not look away. Neither did she. For a moment, which she would afterwards be unable to measure, 3 seconds, perhaps 4, the room was very still. It was the stillness of 2 people who have just recognized, without a single word of admission passing between them, that they are standing on the same secret. Mrs. Penhaligon will show you to the schoolroom, he said. You will meet Miss Felicity and Miss Jemima at 4. You may bring your trunk this evening. A carriage will be sent for it. Where do you presently reside? In Bertie House, my lord. Berkeley Square. Something passed behind his eyes at the name Bertie. It was there, and it was gone. He did not remark upon it. Very well, the carriage will be at the servants' entrance at 7. She rose. My lord. She curtsied. She turned to go. She had reached the double doors and had laid her gloved hand upon the brass when he spoke again, very quietly, at her back. Mrs. Vale. She stopped. She did not turn. You did not ask what the previous governess called Miss Felicity. No, my lord. Nor did you ask why I permit a child of 9 to keep silence for a week if she chooses. No, my lord. May I ask why? She considered the door a moment. The boar and the 3 stars were carved into a small brass shield above the handle. She had not noticed them on the way in. Because it is not my business, my lord, she said. Yet. There was a breath. She thought perhaps he laughed, though no sound came. Very well, he said, until 4 o'clock. She opened the door and left. Mrs. Penhaligon was waiting in the corridor. She did not ask how it had gone. She walked ahead of Tabitha to the foot of the great stair, and there, in the shadow beneath the landing, she stopped and turned. Madam, she said, her voice was very low, I have been in this house 11 years. I keep his lordship's keys and his lordship's counsel. I keep no other man's. I understand you, Mrs. Penhaligon. You have a face I have seen before, Mrs. Vale. Have I? Once, at a churning, in a still room that smelled of rose water and lavender. Tabitha's hand tightened on the newel post. She said nothing. His lordship has offered you the post, Mrs. Penhaligon continued, quieter still. I have not heard him offer any of the 4 before you. The terms I heard through that door. I do not ask what you are called or why. I ask only this. Be gentle with the little ones. I mean to be. Then we shall get on, madam. She curtsied, briskly, and led the way upward. The schoolroom occupied a bright chamber on the 2nd floor at the back of the house, above the mews, where the noise of Grosvenor Square did not reach. A globe stood on a low table. 2 small writing desks faced a larger one. A window seat looked down onto a bare-walled garden with a sundial at the center. They will be brought to you at 4, Mrs. Penhaligon said. Miss Felicity does not speak on Wednesdays. Miss Jemima will not eat meat that has been cut by any hand but her sister's. His lordship dines at 7. You will not be summoned. You will take your meals in the schoolroom for the first week, that the children may grow used to you without the tax of company. Thank you, Mrs. Penhaligon. The housekeeper hesitated a fraction. Then she reached into her apron pocket and drew out a small bunch of dried lavender tied with a scrap of blue thread. For the drawer, madam. Miss Jemima cannot sleep if the linen does not smell of it. She laid the sprig on the writing desk and went out, closing the door softly behind her. Tabitha stood alone in the schoolroom. She had not slept in 3 nights. She had walked to Grosvenor Square through the frost with her hands numb, inside cotton gloves, and her heart beating under the boar, and the 3 stars sewn against her ribs. She had answered 5 questions in 3 languages and 1 in the tongue of her mother's rose garden, and she had been offered twice the ordinary wage by a man who had tilted his good ear toward her and asked her about damask roses, and had not, at any point, said her father's name aloud. He had not needed to. He had told her, in the smaller hand at the bottom of a sheet of paper, that in this house she was to answer to no authority but his own. She sat down on the window seat. She permitted herself, for the first time since Marlow Street, to close her eyes for the space of 6 breaths. When she opened them, she stood, crossed to the little writing desk, and picked up the sprig of lavender. She turned it in her fingers. Then she set it very carefully in the small drawer where a child would find it that night, and she began to arrange the schoolroom for the 2 little girls who were coming to her at 4. At 3:45 she stood by the window. At 3 minutes past she heard small feet on the stair. The door opened and Mrs. Penhaligon brought in 2 black-haired little girls in white muslin frocks tied with sky-blue sashes, their hair plaited with blue ribbon, their eyes gray as a January sword blade. They did not smile. They did not curtsy. They stood shoulder to shoulder, hand in hand, and looked at her. Tabitha did not move from the window. She did not kneel down and coo. She did not offer them her name. She looked at them as an equal looks at equals who happen to be smaller than she is, and she said, quite simply, "I am Mrs. Vale." The older one, Felicity, she guessed by the half-inch, said nothing. "Wednesday." "Very well." The younger one, Jemima, tilted her head. "You have a bruise on your wrist," she said. Tabitha glanced down. Her cuff had slipped a quarter of an inch. The purple mark of Lady Hyacinth's thimble was visible above the bone. "I do." "Did someone hurt you?" "Yes." "Are you sorry?" "No." Jemima considered her a long moment. Then, very slowly, she let go of her sister's hand, walked the length of the schoolroom, and stood in front of Tabitha, close enough to touch the hem of her skirt. She did not touch it. She looked up. "Good," she said. Felicity from across the room spoke. "You may sit at the large desk, Mrs. Vale." Tabitha inclined her head. "Thank you, Miss Marbury." That was the first day. They read from an old volume of Aesop. They did not read the fables about lions. They read the fable of the ant and the grasshopper, and the one about the crow and the pitcher, and when Jemima's finger stopped at a hard word, Tabitha did not supply it. She waited. Jemima worked the word out under her breath and looked up in small triumph and did not require praise, and Tabitha noted that also, and did not give praise, and Jemima's shoulders relaxed a fraction of an inch that Tabitha would remember afterwards as the first true wage she had earned in that house. At 6 o'clock a maid brought a supper tray, bread, thin soup, an apple cut into 8 pieces on a plate with a blue rim. Jemima looked at the apple. "Who cut this?" she asked. "I did, miss," the maid said. Jemima did not touch the apple. Tabitha reached over, took a piece, ate it, and reached for the second piece. She passed it to Felicity. "Cut the next one," she said, "for your sister." Felicity took the knife. She cut the next apple into 8 pieces of a size slightly less even than the maid's. She pushed the plate to Jemima. Jemima ate. At 7:30, when the little girls had been taken to bed and the schoolroom lay in a warm hush of banked fire, there came a soft knock at the door. It was Mrs. Penhaligon, with a candle. "His lordship desires me to say, madam, that your trunk has been fetched from Berkeley Square. It stands in your bedchamber. Bertie House has not been informed of the direction. His lordship considered it unnecessary." "Thank you, Mrs. Penhaligon." "His lordship desires also that you take breakfast in the morning room tomorrow, 8 o'clock. He wishes to speak with you before the children rise." "I shall be there." The housekeeper curtsied and turned to go. At the door she paused. "Madam, he has not taken breakfast with any woman not of his blood in 11 years. She closed the door behind her. Tabitha stood a long moment in the middle of the schoolroom. Then she crossed to the small adjoining chamber which was now hers. Her trunk stood at the foot of the bed. Someone, she suspected Mrs. Penhaligon, had laid a fresh nightdress upon the coverlet and a sprig of the same dried lavender upon the pillow. On the bedside table, in a plain white saucer, sat a single dried rose petal. It was the petal of a damask. She did not weep. She had trained herself out of weeping years ago. She sat on the edge of the bed. She took her sewing kit from the trunk. She unpicked, very carefully, the 12 small stitches that held the lining of the corset to the outer bodice of her wool gown, and she drew out the little gold ring with the boar and the 3 stars. She held it in the flat of her palm. Then, in a movement that surprised her, she did not put it back in the lining. She rose, crossed to the writing table, where the drawer held the second sprig of lavender for Jemima, and she opened a smaller drawer above it. She laid the ring inside, on a folded scrap of paper, and closed the drawer. 2 floors below, in his study, the Earl of Bramwell sat under a shaded lamp, and Mr. Strickland stood before him with a leather satchel. On the desk lay 2 sheets of parchment. One was the fair copy of the terms of employment of Mrs. Vale. The other bore a red wax seal, already broken, and began, "Under the sign manual of His Royal Highness the Prince Regent, in the matter of the attainted Viscountcy of Ravenhill." Marbury laid his hand flat over it. "She is under this roof, Strickland." "So I understand, my lord. Not one paper leaves this house. Not one word to the Regent's office. Not one line to Bertie. Not yet. May I ask why not yet? Because she has come through my door, as Mrs. Vale. She has taken a wage of £120. She has, at 4 o'clock, permitted my sister to cut her an apple. I will not have her told, tonight, that she is a viscountess. I will not have her walk to her own name across a room she did not choose to enter. The regent's patience. The regent will wait. He owes me Badajoz, and Vitoria, and 3 loans not yet called in. He will wait until she is ready. She does not yet know that I know. Strickland inclined his head. Marbury folded the parchment into the drawer and turned the key. Tomorrow at 8 I take breakfast with her in the morning room. She will pour the coffee herself, and I will let her, because she has been pouring another woman's coffee for 2 years, and does not yet know that in this house the coffee is her own. 2 floors above him, in the small chamber that adjoined the schoolroom, Tabitha Harcourt sat on the edge of a strange bed with a dried damask petal in one hand, and, in the drawer beside her, a signet ring no longer stitched against her ribs but resting, for the first time in 10 years, on open paper, in a house whose master had asked her about her mother's roses and had not asked her name. She did not yet know that at 8 o'clock the following morning she would sit down opposite the Earl of Bramwell over silver and porcelain, and that he would pass her the coffee pot with his own hand, and that when she said, "Thank you, my lord," he would answer, very quietly, "You are welcome under this roof, madam," and that she would hear, in the way he said "under this roof," an entire sentence he had not spoken. She only knew, that first night in Grosvenor Square, that she had crossed a threshold and that on the far side of it a housekeeper had recognized her and had said nothing, and a 9-year-old girl had let her sit at the large desk, and a 7-year-old girl had eaten an apple, and a tall, gray-eyed man with a scar through his eyebrow had written a line in a small, precise hand which meant, in the private language of a house that ran on power, "In this room, no one may touch you but me, and I will not." She blew out the candle. Outside the window the snow was thickening over Grosvenor Square, and inside the drawer of the writing table the boar and the 3 stars of Ravenhill lay, for the first time since she was 12 years old, in the open air of a room where a man 3 floors below already knew the answer to the question she had not yet been asked. By the 5th week at Bramwell Park, the routine of the house had rearranged itself around a woman who called herself Mrs. Vale. Felicity carried her books to the schoolroom without being asked. Jemima, who had not spoken a full sentence to any adult in the 6 months since her parents were buried, now recited French verbs at the breakfast table in a voice as clear as a chapel bell. Mrs. Penhaligon lingered in doorways to watch them and pretended she was counting linen. The February light over Lincolnshire was thin and pewter-colored, the sort of light that turned the frost on the yew hedges to something like beaten silver. Bramwell Park sat low in the fen, its long east front of grey stone facing a lake half frozen at the edges. Rooks lifted from the elms at dawn and settled again by dusk. Nothing hurried here, nothing was allowed to hurry. Tabitha had learned to move through the great rooms with her hands folded before her, her eyes half a beat lower than a governess's ought to be. The auburn coil at the nape of her neck was pinned so tightly that no strand escaped even when she bent over Jemima's slate. The old string-colored wool dress had been replaced by 2 identical gray merinos ordered without her leave from the village dressmaker, and left on her bed with a card in Mrs. Penhaligon's round hand that read, "Compliments of the household. Please do not argue with me, my dear." She had not argued. She had, however, kept the boar and the 3 stars sewn into the new corset lining, as she had kept them sewn into every corset lining since she was 12 years old. That morning Felicity was working her way through the conjugations of aimer. She stumbled at the imperfect tense and looked up in dismay. "Jamais," Tabitha said quietly. "You loved, once. Not now, not tomorrow. Once." "Then it is a sad tense," Felicity said. "It is only sad if the loving stopped." Tabitha did not look at the child while she said it. She was looking out through the schoolroom window at a groom crossing the courtyard with 2 brace of pheasants over his shoulder. Sometimes the loving does not stop, then the imperfect tense means something else entirely. Jemima, who had been drawing a rabbit in the margin of her copybook, put her pencil down and considered her governess with grave gray eyes. "Papa used to say, 'Jamais,'" she offered. "Then it did not stop," Tabitha said. She rose, closed the grammar, and set the girls at their embroidery hoops before the fire. Mrs. Penhaligon would come at 11 to take them out into the frost for their walk. Tabitha's own hour had begun. She meant to fetch the 2nd volume of Voltaire's Siècle de Louis XIV. From the library, Marbury had put it aside for her 3 nights before, with the ribbon marker moved to the passage on the frond, and had said nothing about it, which was his way of saying a great many things at once. The library at Bramwell Park lay at the southeast corner of the house, its 2 tall windows filled with the same pewter light. 14,000 volumes rose to a coffered ceiling of walnut and gilt. A fire had been laid but not yet lit. The great writing table stood in the center of the room, its inkstand of silver-mounted crystal catching the morning like a lantern. The Earl's usual seat was empty. She crossed to the shelf where he had left the Voltaire. She had her hand on the spine when she saw the parchment. It lay flat on the writing table, not folded, not weighted, as if placed there in the last minute before its reader was called away. Vellum, cream-colored, 10 inches by 14, its edges dressed in gilt. Along the head ran a heavy Gothic script she had learned in the schoolroom of her father's house before she was ever taught to darn. Georgius Augustus Fredericus, Princeps Regens, Britanniarum Rex, in nomine et auctoritate Patris Nostri Georgii Tertii. She did not move. The lower half of the sheet was written in the plain chancery hand of the Prince Regent's private secretary. She saw Ravenhill. She saw Harcourt. She saw Sola et unica Heres. At the foot, pendant from a silk cord of green and white, hung a disc of dark red wax the size of her palm. She did not need to lift it to know the impression. The Regent's crowned arms of the United Kingdom, encircled by the motto of the Order of the Garter. The letters patent for the restoration of the Viscountcy of Ravenhill, in favor of Tabitha Louise Harcourt, sole and only heir of Edward Robert Harcourt, 9th Viscount, attainted March 1811. Attainted. She had said the word to herself once a week for 7 years. The estate at Ravenhill Court had gone to the Crown, the title had gone into the dark, and a girl of 12 had gone out of the servant's door of her own home with her mother's amethyst brooch in her petticoat and her father's signet in her hand. That signet lay against her rib at this moment. The letters patent lay on the table before her. She reached out one gloved hand and did not touch it. It was not the parchment that undid her. It was the ribbon marker in the Voltaire beside it. Moved that morning to a passage she had not yet been shown. She turned her head to read it, because her body did not yet know what else to do with itself. Il est plus honteux de se défier de ses amis que d'être trompé par eux. It is more shameful to distrust one's friends than to be deceived by them. Behind her, the library door closed. Not loudly, it closed the way he did everything. Precisely, with the small final click of a man who never left a room until the room was in the state he wished to leave it in. "You are early, Mrs. Vale," Marbury said. She did not turn at once. She let the gloved hand fall to her side. She counted 3 breaths through the tightness in her chest, as her mother had taught her the winter before the arrest. "So are you, my lord," she said. "You were to be at the home farm until noon. I rode back. Why?" "Because," he said, "I left this on the table." She turned then. He stood in the doorway still, one hand on the brass knob, one hand at his side. He wore his riding coat of dark green, mud on the tops of his hessians, snow melting in his black hair, where he had not troubled to put on a hat. The scar over his right brow was livid in the cold. His gray eyes were on her face, not on the parchment, and she understood then that he had heard her step in the corridor from 3 rooms away, deaf ear or no, and that he had ridden back at first light not to retrieve the letters patent, but to be in the library at the exact moment she found them. "You meant me to see it," she said. "Yes. Why not simply give it to me?" He did not answer at once. He shut the door behind him with the same small click and came into the room until he stood at the far end of the writing table. He did not sit. He set his gloves down on the corner of the table and the silver head of his cane against the leg, and then he put both hands flat on the vellum, on either side of the great red seal, and looked at her across it. "Because I would not have you receive it from my hand," he said. "I would have you find it. There is a difference." "Explain the difference." "If I put it in your hand," he said, "then for the rest of our lives you will owe it to me. If you find it, you owe it to your father, to yourself, to the boar and the 3 stars you have been keeping in your corset since you were a child. I will not have my wife enter her own inheritance through a door I opened." The word wife went through her like a struck bell. She kept her face still. "You presume a great deal, my lord." "I presume nothing that I have not already earned the right to presume," he said quietly. But I will not press it, not today. Today is not for us. Today is for the letters patent. She looked down at the red seal. She looked at his hands on either side of it. She saw, on the small finger of his left, the ring she had seen every day for 6 weeks, the boar of Bramwell and its 3 stars. She saw, upon the parchment beneath his palm, the same boar and the same 3 stars in the arms she had lost. The 2 devices were not identical, but they were kin, as her father had once said in a voice made rough by wine and pride, over a fire in the library at Ravenhill Court, in the last winter before the world ended. "How long?" she said. "6 months ago I knew who you were." She lifted her eyes. 6 months, he repeated. "Since the last week of August. My agent in Manchester traced the sale of a Harcourt christening spoon at a pawnbroker in Cheapside. The pawnbroker was inclined to remember the woman who had brought it. A housekeeper turned away from Bertie House in Grosvenor Square without a character, over a matter of a silver salt cellar she had not stolen. The housekeeper remembered a red-haired girl who called herself Mrs. Vale and slept in the attic with the mending. That was in September. In October I set Strickland to work upon the attainder. In November I laid the case before the Regent in a private audience at Carlton House. In January he signed. In January, she repeated. On the 14th. She had darned Cassandra Bertie's rose-pink gown on the 14th of January. She had been fined 6 pence for a drop of wax. "You did not tell me," she said. "No. I have been in your house for 5 weeks. You have set me at your own table twice. You have put Voltaire in my hand. You have taught your sisters to say, 'Bonjour, Mrs. Vale.' And every night you have gone up to bed knowing that in a locked drawer in this room there lay a piece of parchment that would give me back my name, and you did not tell me." "No." "Why?" "Because," he said, "I have watched you take a fine of 6 pence upon your wages, without the tightening of one muscle in your throat. I have watched you feed my sister who had not spoken in 6 months, and stand at her bedside every night until she slept. I have watched you refuse a second candle in your room because you did not wish to be seen as extravagant. I have watched you sew that gray merino at the cuff because you would not send it back to the dressmaker for a mend that you could do yourself. Tabitha Harcourt, I would not have you come to me because I had made you a viscountess. I would have you come to me because you chose to. You presume. I presume nothing." He was very still. "I only tell you what I have watched. And I tell you that I have watched it because I could not help myself. And I tell you now, because you have found the parchment, that the parchment is yours whether you ever look at me again or not. Strickland has the counterpart. The Crown has recorded it. Ravenhill Court is yours by writ. The rents of the last 7 years, held in receivership, are yours. Whether you leave this house tonight in a hired chaise as Viscountess Ravenhill and never speak my name again, or whether you stay, is a matter that concerns only you." He lifted his hands from the vellum. "There," he said, "it is done." The fire that had not been lit gave a little sound of settling ash. Somewhere far off in the house, one of the girls laughed. Tabitha stood with the schoolroom Voltaire forgotten in her right hand and looked at the man across the table from her, at the mud on his boots, at the melted snow at his temple, at the 2 hands he now held loose at his sides as though he had put down a very heavy thing at last. She said, "You said, 'My wife.'" "I did. You have never asked me." "No. Ask me now." He did not move. His face did not change. Only the gray of his eyes darkened, as though a shutter had been opened somewhere behind them. "Not now," he said. "Why not?" "Because you have been Viscountess Ravenhill for less than a minute, and the first offer of marriage you receive as such must not be from a man who has kept you 5 weeks in his schoolroom in a gray merino dress. It must be from a man who has stood at the door of your own house at Ravenhill Court, in the daylight, having ridden there in his own colors, and asked you across the threshold of what is yours. That is a great deal of pageantry, my lord. It is not pageantry, it is respect. It is the difference between a housekeeper who receives an offer from her employer and a viscountess who receives an offer from a suitor. I will not do you the discourtesy of confusing the two." She looked down again at the red seal. She reached out with one gloved hand and, very deliberately, laid 2 fingertips upon the wax. It was cool and slightly rough. She had not touched the arms of the regent before. She had touched, on the day her father was taken, the corner of the warrant of attainder that a king's messenger had set upon the hall table at Ravenhill Court. That wax had been read also. It had been the same wax. The crown that had taken her father's name from her 7 years and 11 months ago in a rainy March had given it back to her on a Tuesday morning in a Lincolnshire library with a fire that had not been lit. She did not weep. She had promised herself, at 12, that she would not weep in front of anyone who could see her, ever again. But she took off her right glove, she set it upon the table, she reached into the bosom of the gray merino, beneath the linen fichu, and drew out the small linen bag that had lived against her ribs for 7 years and 11 months. She untied the drawstring, she tipped the signet into her bare palm. The boar and the 3 stars. She laid it on the vellum beside the red seal. "There," she said, in a voice that was almost steady. "You may compare them, my lord. They are close cousins." He looked at the 2 devices side by side. He looked at her. He did not touch either. "I know the arms of Ravenhill," he said. "My father used to ride out to hunt with yours in the season of 1802. I was 14. Your father let me hold the reins of his black hunter while he lit his pipe. He told me the boar was for courage and the 3 stars for the 3 virtues a Harcourt must never lose. I did not ask him what they were. I did not think I should need to know." "They were truth, mercy, and constancy," Tabitha said. "I have found," he said, "that a man who has all 3 is very rare. A woman who has kept all 3 through 7 years in the attics of Grosvenor Square is rarer still. That is why I sent the carriage in the snow." She picked up the signet again. She did not put it back in the linen bag. She slid it, at last, onto the little finger of her right hand. It had been made for her father's finger. It hung a little loose upon hers. She closed her fingers over it. "I am not going to leave tonight, my lord," she said. "No? I am going to finish teaching Jemima the imperfect tense, and Felicity is going to learn the pluperfect by Friday, because she is quicker than she knows. And after that, I would like to see the letter that Strickland has drafted for the receiver of the Ravenhill rents, because I imagine there is a tenant on the South Field who has been paying more than he should since 1811, and I would very much like to send him back the difference." "There is such a tenant," Marbury said gravely. "His name is Kellow. He has 6 children. Then he shall have back the difference before Lady Day," she said. "Yes, madam. And when the season begins in April, we will be in London." "Yes, madam. And there will be a ball at Carlton House, I imagine, because there is always a ball at Carlton House. There is one already announced, a masquerade, the 18th of May. "Good," Tabitha said. She looked at him across the table. She looked at him with the boar and the 3 stars on her finger and the letters patent between them. "Then I will meet you there, my lord, in my own colors." For the first time in 5 weeks, she saw the corner of his mouth move. It was not a smile. It was smaller than that, and more dangerous. It was the movement of a man who has been holding a position under fire for a very long time and has just heard the bugle sound for the counterattack. "I shall look for you, madam," he said. She curtsied. It was not the low mesura of a governess. It was not yet the deep bow of a viscountess receiving an earl. It was, precisely, the courtesy of an equal to an equal, and they both knew what it was. She left the Voltaire upon the table. She left the letters patent upon the table. She left the little linen bag beside them, empty. She did not need to hide the signet any longer. She went out into the corridor and closed the door with the same small click he had used, and stood for a moment with her palm flat against the walnut panel, while the pewter light from the tall window at the end of the passage fell across her feet. Then she went up the stairs to the schoolroom to teach a 9-year-old the difference between the loving that had once been and the loving that had not stopped. She went into the schoolroom without knocking, because the schoolroom was her country now, and Felicity looked up over the embroidery hoop with the quick attention of a child who had learned to read every shift of a face. "You have been crying," Felicity said, in the tone of a scientist reporting a small observation. "I have not," Tabitha said truthfully. "You look as though you had." "I look," Tabitha said, "as though something has happened. Something has. Nothing that need trouble you today. Come, we have 4 verbs still, and Mrs. Penhaligon means to have you out by 11:30. Jemima, without lifting her head from her copybook, said, "Was it a letter?" "Yes." "A sad one?" "No," Tabitha said, and heard her own voice as though from a great distance. "Not a sad one, only an old one, older than either of you." She sat down between them and drew Jemima's slate towards her and began to write out, in the round chancery hand that a housekeeper's daughter would not have been taught, the 4 verbs of the day. The signet ring on the small finger of her right hand caught the pewter light of the schoolroom window and threw a small hot spark against the wall. Neither child mentioned it. Both children saw it. Felicity once reached out one finger and touched the gold, quickly, as one touches a thing to be sure it is real, and then went back to her verbs without a word. Downstairs, in the library, the Earl of Bramwell had already rung for Mrs. Penhaligon, and had already given 3 orders in the low, even voice that made the servants of Bramwell Park move as though the house were on quiet fire. A room on the south front was to be aired, and hung with fresh curtains. The great bedchamber that had been shut since his mother's death was to be opened, the shutters unbarred, the dust sheets folded. A groom was to ride at once to Lincoln for the county's best seamstress, and to bring her back that night in the closed chariot, at any cost she named. "Not for the schoolroom?" Mrs. Penhaligon said, folding her hands under her apron. "Not for the schoolroom," Marbury said, "for a viscountess who has been wearing a grey merino too long. My lord. Marigold." He looked at her across the writing table. It was the first time in 6 weeks he had used her Christian name. "You knew her when she was 10 years old." "I did, my lord." "You have said nothing." "I judged, my lord, that she would wish to be the one to say it." "You judged very rightly," Marbury said. "You will now judge whether she can be brought, before the season, to accept a lady's maid, a wardrobe, and a carriage of her own, without believing that any of the 3 has been imposed upon her." Mrs. Penhaligon considered him with the steady brown eyes of a woman who had run 3 great houses in her life and had never lost so much as a teaspoon in any of them. "She will accept them, my lord," she said, "if you make her believe they are her father's ghost apologizing to her for 7 years in an attic, not otherwise." Marbury was silent a long moment. "Thank you, Marigold," he said. "My lord." She withdrew. He heard her heavy, soft tread go up the servants' stair to the schoolroom, and heard, a moment later, Jemima's laugh, high and unafraid, roll down the front stair like a small, bright coin. He sat down at the writing table for the first time that morning. He drew a fresh sheet of hot-pressed paper towards him. He dipped his pen. He wrote, in the hand that his old adjutant in the peninsula had once called the plainest hand in the British Army, 3 lines to his solicitor in London, and a 4th line to his banker in the Strand, and a 5th line to a certain Mr. Kellow, tenant of the South Field at Ravenhill. 6 children, arrears none. He sealed them all in the black wax of Bramwell. He rang for a groom. Then he sat, alone, in the library where an hour before a red-haired woman in a grey merino dress had put a signet ring upon her own finger, without asking his leave, and he looked at the empty table, where the letters patent still lay open in the pewter light, and he permitted himself, for the first time in 18 years of a life spent in disciplined and useful silence, one full, unguarded breath. That evening, the fire in the library was lit at last. Marbury had Strickland brought down from London by the night mail. They worked until 3 in the morning at the writing table. By dawn, the receiver of the Ravenhill rents in Cheapside had been ordered to prepare an accounting, 7 years deep, of every farthing collected from every tenant of the estate. By breakfast, a letter had gone out to the incumbent of the parish church at Ravenhill Village, requesting that the family pew be reopened, aired, and dressed by Lady Day. By luncheon, a second letter had gone out to a certain house in Grosvenor Square, addressed to Lord Arthur Bertie, requesting the pleasure of an interview at his lordship's earliest convenience upon a matter of £8,000 in outstanding notes of hand, which the Earl of Bramwell was regretfully obliged to call in. Marbury sealed the last letter himself, in the black wax of Bramwell, and set it down beside the tea. Across the table, in the grey merino she had not yet troubled to change, Tabitha read it through once, folded it neatly at the crease he had made, and handed it back. "The 18th of May, my lord?" she said. "The 18th of May, madam," he said. Outside, the frost on the yew hedges had begun to loosen. A single rook lifted from the elms and did not settle again. In the schoolroom above, Felicity Marbury was reciting, in a voice as clear as a chapel bell, the pluperfect tense. J'avais aimé, tu avais aimé, il avait aimé. I had loved, you had loved, he had loved. The tense of a thing completed, the tense of a thing that had, against every expectation of grammar, not stopped at all. And in the pocket of a grey merino dress, warmed by a hand that no longer trembled, The boar and the 3 stars of Ravenhill rode at last in daylight, upon the finger of the woman for whom they had been forged. 3 months before a masquerade at Carlton House, at which a certain Miss Bertie of Grosvenor Square had already ordered a gown of rose-pink gauze over white satin, and had not yet been told that the ginger scarecrow who had darned it was about to walk beneath the chandeliers as a viscountess in her own right, upon the arm of the Ice Lord of Bramwell. The carriage wheels crunched over frozen gravel as the line of lacquered coaches drew up along the courtyard of Carlton House, and the November air smelled of pitch torches and hothouse orchids being carried in through the side entrance in flat wicker trays. 400 candles burned already behind the tall windows. The Prince Regent's masquerade had, by 10 o'clock, become the only party in London. Inside the third carriage sat Tabitha Harcourt, upright, gloved hands folded upon a plain domino of black silk, her mask of unadorned white satin resting across her knees. She wore ivory tonight. The gown had been chosen by the Countess of Ashbourne, Marbury's aunt. Ivory silk, a narrow silver cord at the high waist, no ornament at the throat. On her right hand, over the glove, the signet of Ravenhill. Marbury had ridden ahead. He had sent word 2 hours before, a matter of the Regent's private correspondence. He would meet her within the ballroom itself. She was to enter as Mrs. Vale, one last time, upon the arm of the Countess, and he would find her under the chandelier by the third alcove. Tabitha had read the note twice, folded it very small, and put it inside her reticule. "He does love his own theatre," said the Countess dryly. She was a woman of 60, small and iron-boned. "Do not fret, child. He will be there before the second dance." "I am not fretting, madam." "No," said the Countess, and looked at her with shrewd affection. "You are not. It is one of the things about you that he cannot bear." The carriage stopped. A footman in the Regent's livery opened the door, and the cold poured in. Tabitha put on her mask. The great vestibule of Carlton House was already crowded with dominoes and Turks and shepherdesses, and the noise of them rose to the painted ceiling in a soft roar of taffeta. She kept close to the Countess's elbow. She had learned, in 6 years of service, that a servant who gaped was a servant who was noticed. Tonight the trick was the same. Do not gape. They passed through the double doors into the ballroom. 5 chandeliers burned in a row down the length of the room, each with 100 wax candles. Under them the dancers were forming for the first set. A regiment of scarlet coats, a wave of white muslin, a shepherdess with her mask askew. Tabitha could not see Marbury. "He is not yet arrived," murmured the Countess. "Come, we shall stand near the third alcove." They descended. From the little musicians' gallery above, the first violins struck up a country dance, and a great restless movement of dominoes flowed toward the floor. It was in that shifting that Tabitha saw across the parquet a mask she knew. Rose-pink gauze over white satin, a rose-pink sash, small white gloves to the elbow, a mask of white leather with signet feathers dyed pink, tilted at a careful angle above a small cupid's mouth she had, for 6 years, watched pout in 3 mirrors of a Grosvenor Square dressing room. Cassandra. Behind her, in dark purple velvet and a turban weighted with a white ostrich plume, the unmistakable bulk of Lady Hyacinth Bertie, cutting a passage through the crowd with her painted fan. Tabitha did not flinch. She turned her head half an inch, so that the fall of her hair shielded the line of her jaw. "Aunt," she said, quiet, "I see them. Do not signify. They will not know you in the mask." But Cassandra was making for the little cluster near the third alcove, and Lady Hyacinth was steering her by the elbow. They stopped 6 paces off. Cassandra dropped a curtsy to no one in particular. The signet feathers of the mask trembled. Her eyes were the same hard pale blue that had, in a candle-lit workroom in Grosvenor Square, watched a needle draw a stitch across pink gauze, while its owner said, "Ginger scarecrow," as though the word tasted good in her mouth. Cassandra had not seen her yet. Lady Hyacinth had. The turbaned head turned very slowly, and the small painted eyes fixed themselves upon Tabitha's face, and the fan halted mid-flutter. Even behind the mask, Tabitha felt it. Recognition. Lady Hyacinth was not a fool. She had watched Mrs. Vale bend over a work-basket every night for 2,000 nights. "Cassandra, my love," said Lady Hyacinth, and her voice was silk. "There is a person here I should like you to see." Cassandra turned. She looked at Tabitha for a full second without understanding. The gown was wrong. The way the woman stood, quiet as a candle flame, was wrong. Cassandra had never in her life seen Mrs. Vale stand still without a piece of work in her hands. Then the recognition came. It settled in the mouth first, in a slow shaping of the Cupid's bow into something ugly. "Mama," said Cassandra, half laughing, "it cannot be." "It is, my love. In ivory, at Carlton House." The laugh sharpened. In ivory. Around them, 3 dominoes of unmarried gentlemen had turned their heads. Beyond them, a shepherdess and a Cleopatra had stopped speaking. Cassandra stepped a pace closer. "Mrs. Vale," she said, loud enough for the shepherdess to catch. "Whose gown is that?" Tabitha did not answer. The Countess of Ashbourne opened her fan very deliberately across her own face. "Miss Bertie, you forget yourself." "I forget nothing, madam. I know this woman. She darned my sashes for 6 years upon 8 shillings a quarter. Whose gown is that?" "My own," said Tabitha, quiet. Cassandra's laugh was small and hard as a dropped bead. "Your own." The eyes traveled the ivory silk. They lingered at the waist, at the silver cord, at the pale glove upon which the Ravenhill signet, worn openly for the first time in London, caught the light of the chandelier and threw it back. Cassandra's laugh stopped. "Mamma," she said. Lady Hyacinth had already seen the ring. The turbaned head bent an inch. The painted eyes went first to the bore upon the gold, and then to Tabitha's face, and then quickly across the ballroom as though counting witnesses. She counted, in a heartbeat, the Duchess of Rutland, the Marchioness of Salisbury, 3 cabinet ministers, and the regent's private secretary at the door. The fan closed. "Cassandra," said Lady Hyacinth, low, urgent, "come away." "Come away?" "Mamma, this creature stands under the regent's chandelier in ivory silk and wears—" "Come away, girl." But Cassandra had discovered at 19 that there was a pleasure in being seen at the center of a room, and she had never yet learned that it was a pleasure with teeth. She stepped forward again. Tabitha could smell the orange flower water in her hair. "Take off your mask," said Cassandra. Tabitha looked at her steadily through the eye slits. "Take it off, Mrs. Vale." "I am not obliged," said Tabitha, "to any command of yours." "Cassandra?" Lady Hyacinth's hand closed upon her daughter's wrist. "Enough." Cassandra shook the hand away. The crowd about them had thickened. The music was still playing, but half the couples nearest had stopped forming their set. A tall gentleman in black domino with a scarlet mask paused mid-stride and turned to watch. "You know what she did, madam," said Cassandra to the Countess, her voice rising. "She stole my mother's pearls, in September. We found them in her trunk, sewn into the lining, and we let her go quietly because Mamma pitied her, and now she stands here." "Miss Bertie," the Countess's voice cut. "You will lower your voice." "I will not, madam." Cassandra was breathing quick and shallow. 2 spots of color had risen through the white powder at the top of her cheeks. "She stole. And she wears a ring she has stolen also. Look, all of you. She is wearing a great gentleman's signet upon her finger. She is a governess out of Wardour Street with red hair like a pot boy, and she has robbed." Her hand went up. It was not calculated. Tabitha saw it in the slack of the little Cupid's mouth. Cassandra had never once been contradicted by a room, and the room had begun to turn from her. She reached with her right hand, seized the edge of Tabitha's mask, and wrenched. The ribbon at the back of Tabitha's head broke. The mask came away in Cassandra's small gloved fist. The auburn hair, uncovered, took the chandelier light. The green seawater eyes met Cassandra's without a blink. "Thief." Cassandra's voice cracked upon the word. It went across the ballroom in one clean cut over the fiddles, and the fiddles heard it and faltered, and the country dance folded upon itself and stopped. 400 faces turned. "Thief! Ginger thief! She is my mother's servant. She stole my mother's pearls. Look at her." And she struck. The open palm of a small white glove came across Tabitha's cheek in a flat, clean crack that carried from the 3rd alcove to the door. The whole ballroom heard the slap. Tabitha did not move. She did not put a hand to her face. She did not step back. She lowered her eyes an inch so that her chin was level with the parquet at Cassandra's satin slipper, and she stood, and she waited. 5 red marks began to rise, slowly, upon the porcelain white of her left cheek. The mask lay upon the marble between them. The silence that followed was the silence of a room that had heard everything and did not yet know what it was permitted to think. The Duchess of Rutland, 4 paces off, had lifted her lorgnette. The regent's private secretary at the door had begun to move. Cassandra stood with her hand still raised, and her small mouth open, and her breath loud in her own ears. She had felt the shock travel up her arm. She had never in her life struck another human being. She had also, in that instant, seen something she had not been prepared to see, that the ivory-clad woman before her had not flinched. "Well?" said Cassandra, and her voice was suddenly a child's. "Say something. Deny it. Deny you took the pearls." Tabitha said nothing. "Deny it." Behind Cassandra, Lady Hyacinth had gone the color of tallow. Her fan hung from its ribbon at her wrist. She had understood, in the second the mask left Tabitha's face, exactly how the room was arranged. "Cassandra," she whispered. "Oh, Cassandra." "Deny it?" Tabitha lifted her eyes at last. She did not look at Cassandra. She looked past her, at the double doors at the far end of the ballroom. She had heard, under the ringing in her left ear, a sound she knew. Boot heels upon marble. A cane upon marble. A footfall she had learned in a Lincolnshire library and could no longer mistake for any other footfall in England. She said, very quiet, "I do not need to deny anything, Miss Bertie." The double doors opened. Marbury came in. He was not in domino. He was not in mask. He wore the same midnight blue coat of Weston's, the same cravat in the mathematical, the same silver-embroidered waistcoat. His black cane with the silver head hung from his gloved left hand. Upon his right little finger, in the light of the nearest chandelier, the signet of Bramwell, the boar and the 3 stars in the older setting. He walked. He did not hurry. He came the length of the ballroom in the measured stride the peninsula had given him, the almost imperceptible favoring of the right knee that no one at Almack's had ever noticed and no one at Carlton House would notice tonight, because they were all watching his face. His face was not cold. Tabitha, who had seen it cold across a library table, saw for the first time what it looked like when it was not cold. The gray eyes had gone the color of a winter sea before a gale. The scar across the right brow was very white. The crowd parted for him without being asked. He did not look at Cassandra. He did not look at Lady Hyacinth. He looked, the whole length of the ballroom, at one point only, and that point was the woman in ivory silk with 5 red fingers rising upon her cheek. He stopped 1 pace from Tabitha. He looked, once, at the mark upon her face. Then he turned. He turned only his head, slowly, with the deliberate half-tilt he used when he wished the good ear to hear a thing very exactly, and he fixed his gaze upon Cassandra Bertie's raised hand, which she had not yet had the sense to lower. "Miss Bertie," he said. 2 words. They traveled the ballroom. Cassandra's hand came down as though the string that held it had been cut. "My lord," she said. "My Lord Bramwell, she stole. Miss Bertie." Marbury did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "You struck the woman standing at my left hand." "My lord, she was my mother's." "You struck the woman standing at my left hand," said Marbury, "in the presence of the Prince Regent's household. You will be silent now, Miss Bertie, and you will remain silent, and you will not move from that spot upon the parquet." Cassandra was silent. Marbury lifted his left hand very slightly, and behind him a footman in the Regent's livery stepped forward 1 pace and stood at attention. Marbury turned again, half a step, so that his shoulder was to Tabitha and his face to the ballroom. "My lords," he said, "my ladies." The fiddles had long since stopped. 400 faces waited. "The young woman," said Marbury, "whom Miss Bertie has this evening struck, and whom Miss Bertie has this evening called a thief, is the Viscountess Tabitha Harcourt of Ravenhill, sole surviving issue of the late John Harcourt, 7th Viscount Ravenhill, restored to her father's title and estate by letters patent of His Royal Highness the Prince Regent, sealed at Carlton House upon the 12th of August of this year, and gazetted in the Court Circular of the 14th. He paused. He allowed the ballroom time to hear it. "She is also," he said, "since the 8th of November last, my affianced wife." The silence changed shape. Lady Hyacinth Bertie went now the color of gray water. Her lips moved. She said, "Oh, very small," and her fan slid the last inch off her wrist and fell to the parquet with a small dry sound, like the closing of a book. Then she sat down. There was no chair beneath her. She sat down upon the parquet in a slow crumple of purple velvet and white ostrich, and lay half against the leg of the little inlaid card table by the alcove. Nobody moved to help her. Cassandra had begun to shake. "My lord," she whispered. "My lord, I did not know. I did not know." Marbury did not look at her. He was looking, still, at the ballroom. "Miss Bertie's mother, Lady Hyacinth Bertie," he said, "employed the Viscountess Ravenhill under a false name for 6 years, at 8 shillings the quarter, in her house in Grosvenor Square. Miss Bertie herself, upon a night in March last, was pleased to name the young lady standing at my left hand a scarecrow. Tonight, upon a lie which she and her mother have between them fabricated concerning a rope of pearls, Miss Bertie has struck her Viscountess before 400 witnesses under His Royal Highness's own roof." He turned then, at last, to Cassandra. "Miss Bertie, my lord, you will kneel." The Cupid's mouth opened. "My lord?" "You will kneel," said Marbury, quiet and precise, "upon the parquet of Carlton House, in the presence of this company, and you will beg the pardon of the future Countess of Bramwell for the words you have this night said and the blow you have this night struck. Or by noon tomorrow the house of Bertie will not be received in any drawing room from Berkeley Square to St. James's, and by 2 of the clock your father's bills of exchange to the sum of £8,000, which are held at present at Coutts in my name, will be called in a single instrument." Somewhere in the crowd, a woman said, "Oh, dear God," in a small, clear voice. Cassandra's knees went. She did not so much kneel as fold. The rose-pink gauze crumpled about her upon the marble in a small, pale heap, and her small gloved hands went out before her and rested upon the parquet, and her head went down. The little signet feathers of the mask, still clutched in her right hand, trembled against the floor. "Forgive me," she said. It was almost inaudible. "Louder, Miss Bertie. Forgive me, my lady. Forgive me. I did not know. Forgive me." The head bent lower. Marbury did not answer for her. He turned instead, 1/4, and looked at Tabitha, and for the first time since he had come through the double doors, there was something in his face that was not winter. Tabitha looked back at him. The 5 marks upon her cheek were livid now. She would not touch them tonight. She lifted her chin 1 small precise inch, so that the light of the chandelier fell full upon the mark, and she permitted the ballroom to see it, and she permitted the ballroom to see her steady eyes above it. "My lord," she said, and her voice carried, low, unhurried, the voice that had been trained in a Ravenhill nursery upon Racine and upon the Book of Common Prayer. "I hear Miss Bertie's words." She did not say she forgave. She said only that she had heard. Marbury inclined his head. Then he did a thing that would be talked of at London breakfast tables for a fortnight. He drew off his own right glove, finger by finger, and put it into the pocket of his coat. He took Tabitha's gloved right hand in his own bare one. He lifted it, he turned it, so that the boar and the 3 stars of the Ravenhill signet came uppermost under the light of the chandelier. He bent his head, and he set his mouth, once, deliberately, upon the gold of the ring. Then he lowered her hand, and he kept it, and he turned to face the ballroom with her hand within his. "My lords," he said, "my ladies, I present to you the Viscountess Ravenhill." There was a pause of half a heartbeat, and then a stir began at the far side of the room, near the Duchess of Rutland, that spread. The Duchess of Rutland, 60 years old and mother-in-law to half the cabinet, sank into a curtsy deep enough for a queen. The Marchioness of Salisbury followed, then the smaller ladies, and then, in a great slow rustle of silk and lace and turning heads, the whole of the ballroom. 400 people made their reverence. Cassandra Bertie upon the parquet could not sink lower than she already was, and so she pressed her forehead once, briefly, against the marble. Marbury did not release Tabitha's hand. The regent's private secretary appeared at his shoulder, murmured something low. Marbury nodded once. 2 footmen came forward to lift Lady Hyacinth from the parquet, and to carry her out through a small side door with as much discretion as 40 stone of purple velvet permitted. Another footman took Cassandra by the elbow and drew her to her feet, and led her, small and blind and still holding the crushed signet mask, out of the ballroom the way she had come in. The double doors closed behind her. The Countess of Ashbourne let out a breath Tabitha had not known she was holding. "Well," said the Countess, quiet, at her other elbow. "Well, my dear." The fiddles, above, having consulted with one another in whispers, began, very tentatively, the opening bars of a waltz. Marbury bent his head an inch to Tabitha's good ear. "Will you dance?" he said. "Viscountess?" She looked up at him. The 5 marks were beginning to hurt now. She would feel them for 3 days. She did not care. She inclined her head. "I will, my lord." He led her out onto the parquet. The ballroom opened before them like water. No one else took the floor. It would have been unthinkable, in that first minute, for anyone else to have taken the floor. The Earl of Bramwell led the Viscountess Ravenhill into the center of the parquet beneath the largest chandelier, and he placed his gloved hand at her waist, and she laid her ivory-gloved hand upon his shoulder, and the violins above found their courage and drew the long, slow first phrase of the waltz. They danced. She had, in the schoolroom at Ravenhill, learned to waltz from an Austrian dancing master in 1806. She had not danced it since. She discovered, in Marbury's hand, that the body remembered. Her feet found the box. He danced slowly, giving her the tempo, and she found it, and after the first 8 bars she was not counting. "You did not flinch," he said at last, half under his breath. "No, my lord." "You did not weep." "No, my lord." "You did not," he said, quieter still. "Look for me." She met his eyes. "I heard you at the door." His hand at her waist tightened, once, very small, and then eased. They completed the circuit of the parquet. Around them, other couples began, tentatively, to take the floor. Within 4 bars the ballroom was dancing again, as if nothing had occurred, and everyone in it knew that everything had occurred. Tabitha felt the mark upon her cheek. She did not lift a hand to it. She turned her face a small, precise degree so that when the light of the chandelier struck her, it struck also the 5 red fingers of Cassandra Bertie's palm, and she let them be seen. She would let them be seen the rest of the night. Marbury saw what she was doing. His mouth moved at the corner in a thing that was almost, but not quite, a smile. "Viscountess." "My lord." "When we have finished this waltz," he said, quiet, at her good ear, "I shall take you into supper upon my arm. And after supper, if you will permit it, I shall present you formally to the regent, who has inquired thrice this fortnight when he might have the honor." "I shall permit it, my lord. And when we leave this house tonight, you will not return to Ashbourne House. My aunt has already sent for your things. You will sleep tonight under my roof in Grosvenor Square, in the room that has been my late mother's since she was a bride." She looked up at him. "Is that quite proper, my lord?" "My aunt will lie in the next chamber," he said, "and the notice will be in the Gazette at 9 tomorrow morning. It will be proper by breakfast." She lowered her eyes to hide what was in them. They turned, once more, under the great chandelier. Somewhere at the far end of the ballroom, a small side door opened and closed as Cassandra Bertie was put into a hackney in the courtyard. Somewhere in another room of Carlton House, Lady Hyacinth was being revived with hartshorn upon a chaise longue. Somewhere, in a house in Grosvenor Square, Lord Arthur Bertie was drinking his 4th glass of brandy at his own fireside, and did not yet know that at 8 in the morning a clerk from Coutts's would knock upon his door. Tabitha did not think of any of them. Marbury bent his head once more. "There is one more thing," he said, "Viscountess, that I would ask of you tonight." "Yes, my lord?" "When they open the doors to the supper-room in half an hour," he said, "walk in upon my arm as though the mark upon your cheek is not there. Do not hide it. Do not have it powdered. Let every woman in that room see it, and let every man in that room know who put it there, and let them all understand that you have chosen, tonight, not to speak of it." She looked up at him. "I had," she said quietly, "already decided upon it, my lord." His hand at her waist tightened once more, and this time it did not ease. He drew her a fraction closer than the waltz strictly permitted, and no one watching would have known, and everyone watching saw. The violins moved into the second phrase. Under the 5th chandelier, at the far end of the ballroom, a single footman in the regent's livery crossed the parquet at the edge of the wall and came, discreetly, to Marbury's elbow, between the 6th and 7th bars, and murmured 6 words at his good ear. Marbury did not stop dancing. He inclined his head an inch, said "Very well," and turned Tabitha once more beneath the chandelier, so that her back was to the door and her face to the length of the ballroom. "My lord?" "A matter of the Bertie carriage," he said. At the gate. It seems Lord Arthur Bertie has arrived, having been sent for by his wife, and is at present being detained in the courtyard by two of the regent's grooms because he is very drunk and is demanding, at the top of his voice, to know whether it is true that his daughter has struck a viscountess. He looked down at her. There was, at last, something like a smile at the corner of his mouth, and it was not a kind one. "It is going," he said quietly, "to be a long night, Viscountess." She met his eyes. "I have had," she said, "longer." The violins turned them once more beneath the chandelier, and the mark upon her cheek burned, and she did not touch it, and above them in the gallery a boy of 14 was already sharpening a quill to write down, for a paper that would be in every coffee-house in London before noon, the account of what had this evening occurred at Carlton House between the Earl of Bramwell, the Viscountess Ravenhill, and the youngest daughter of the house of Bertie. The first line said, "The whole of London this morning is speaking of one slap." Down upon the marble floor of the great saloon, the world of Tabitha Harcourt had narrowed to a single sound, and that sound was the returning of the violins. The Earl of Bramwell did not release her. He kept her hand in his through the last figure of the set, and when the music ended, he did not lead her from the floor. He led her instead toward the wall of tall mirrors where the crowd was thickest, and where Lady Hyacinth Bertie stood in her purple velvet with one hand upon her daughter's shoulder, and the other spread flat against her own throat as though holding something down. Cassandra had not moved. The mask hung by its ribbon from her wrist. The 5 red marks upon Tabitha's cheek had begun already to darken, but the 5 white marks upon Cassandra's palm had not yet faded, and both were visible to the room. Marbury stopped before them. He did not raise his voice. In a saloon of 400 souls he did not need to. When the Ice Lord chose to speak, the room learned silence very quickly, and the room learned it now. "Lady Hyacinth," he said, "Miss Bertie, Lord Arthur, if you would step forward from behind your wife." Lord Arthur Bertie shuffled forward from the pillar where he had been attempting to become part of the plaster. His cravat was loose. The brandy had gone out of his face and left only the redness of the nose, which now looked less like drink and more like a lantern hung upon a sinking ship. "My lord," Lady Hyacinth began, "there has been the most unfortunate—" "You will be silent," Marbury said, "or you will leave the room. Choose." She was silent. He turned. Then he turned toward the room, and not toward the Berties. The Prince Regent, upon his dais at the far end of the saloon, set down his glass of champagne. The Duchess of Devonshire lowered her fan. A hush spread outward from Marbury, as ripples from a stone dropped into water, and the whole of London society leaned forward 1 inch to hear. "The young woman," Marbury said, "whom Miss Bertie has this evening struck across the face, and named a thief before you all, is Tabitha Harcourt, Viscountess of Ravenhill, in her own right, heiress restored by letter patent of His Royal Highness the Prince Regent, sealed the 16th day of December last, and standing this night beneath the roof of Carlton House, by his own express invitation." He paused. "She is also, since the 11th of November, my affianced wife." The saloon did not gasp. Something larger than a gasp went through it. It was the sound of 400 throats drawing in air at once and forgetting to release it, and beneath that sound, from somewhere near a pillar, came the small dry crack of a fan snapping in a woman's hand. Lady Hyacinth's mouth opened. No sound emerged from it. Her turban, with its purple plumes and its single white ostrich feather, listed slightly to the left as her head began to move upon her shoulders in a small circle she did not seem to command. Marcus Marbury lifted her daughter's wrist. He held it as a magistrate might hold a piece of evidence, not roughly, but so that every guest in the room saw the white marks upon the palm. "Miss Bertie," he said, and his voice was very quiet now, "you will kneel." Cassandra Bertie did not kneel. Her chin rose. The mask swung from her wrist. 2 spots of color, unpainted and true, burned in her cheeks. "I will not," she said. "Before this creature? Before a governess who—" "Kneel," said Marbury. He did not repeat it a 3rd time. He did not need to. Something in the single syllable was colder than the marble under their slippers, and Cassandra Bertie felt the cold pass through her rose-pink silk, and through her stays, and through her skin, and her knees, which had been trained since the age of 4 to bend only before princes and altars, bent now of their own accord. She went down slowly. The gauze of the overskirt whispered against the floor. Her hands, in their white gloves, folded themselves in her lap because they no longer knew what else to do. Her mother made a small sound behind her, a sound not of protest, but of a woman watching a bank close its doors upon her. "You will beg the pardon," Marbury said, "of the future Countess of Bramwell. You will beg it here, in this room, in the hearing of these 400 witnesses, or when tomorrow's clock strikes noon, the house of Bertie will cease to be received in 7 of the great houses of London, whose masters and mistresses stand within this saloon at this moment, and whose eyes I have met this evening. And your father's notes of hand, £8,000 bearing his signature and mine, drawn between the years 12 and 16, and held in my strong box in Grosvenor Square, will be presented at his bank at the opening of business, and called in full." Lord Arthur Bertie made a sound then that was not a word. "Speak, Miss Bertie," Marbury said. Cassandra's face was wet. She had not known it was wet. The 2 spots of color had spread across her cheeks and down her throat, and the shame of that was worse than the kneeling, worse than the ruined coiffure, worse even than the sum her father owed, which she had never before heard spoken aloud. "I beg," she said, and her voice cracked upon it, and she began again. "I beg your pardon, my lady." "Louder," said Marbury. "I beg your pardon, my lady." "For what?" "For striking you. For the Penniless. I placed them in your trunk. I placed them there myself. There was no theft." The saloon released its air at last. It came out as a single long sigh, 400 throats letting go together, and the sigh had in it wonder and appetite and the terrible pleasure of witnessing a fall, and beneath all that the small clear note of relief that the fall was not one's own. Lady Hyacinth Bertie fainted then. She did it with a certain grandeur, sinking backward into the arms of a footman who had been standing behind her the whole while for precisely this purpose, and her turban rolled from her head and stopped at the toe of Marbury's Hessian boot, where it lay upon the marble like a shot bird. He did not look down at it. He turned to Tabitha. She was still standing where she had been standing when the slap had come. Her chin had not lowered. Her sea-green eyes had not filled. The mark upon her cheek was livid now, but her mouth had the same small composure it had worn in the servants' passage of the Bertie house on the night she had unpicked the lining of a bodice to look at a boar and 3 stars sewn into wool. "My lady," Marbury said, and he offered his arm. She took it. They walked from the wall of mirrors down the long carpeted stripe that had opened in the center of the crowd, and the crowd did not close behind them. Dowagers who had cut her that very evening now turned their painted mouths into small, careful smiles. A viscountess who had passed her at supper without a nod dropped a curtsy so deep the ostrich plumes in her hair swept the marble. The Duchess of Devonshire inclined her head 1 exact degree, no more, no less, and by that degree the season was decided. At the far end of the saloon, the Prince Regent had risen from his crimson chair. He was fat and painted and very tired, and his stays creaked as he moved, but he had once been a prince who danced, and he remembered how to receive a lady when a lady was worth receiving. He came 3 paces down from the dais to meet her. He took her ungloved hand. Marbury had drawn the glove off during the last figure of the quadrille, and neither of them had noticed until now, and he raised it to his lips. "Ravenhill's daughter," he said. "Your father and I hunted the New Forest in '99. He rode better than any man I knew. Welcome home, my lady." Tabitha curtsied. It was the same curtsy she had made every night for 2 years in Lady Hyacinth's drawing-room, and yet it was not the same curtsy at all, for the woman who rose from it rose into a rank that had waited 11 years for her. "Your Royal Highness is very kind." "Bramwell," said the Regent, turning to Marbury with something almost like a smile, "you will be married from Carlton House. I insist upon it. And you will bring your Countess to me the day after, for I mean to look at her in the daylight, when I can see the color of her hair, which I am told is Harcourt copper. Her mother's, was it not?" "It was, sir," Marbury said. The Regent nodded and returned to his dais, and the violins, at some signal that no one saw, began the opening bars of a country dance, and the ball resumed, because a ball at Carlton House always resumed, no matter what had happened upon its floor. Only then, sheltered by the movement of the reforming sets, did Marcus Marbury lift his hand and touch, at last, the mark upon her cheek. He did it with the pad of his thumb, very lightly. You did not weep, he said. No, said Tabitha. Why? Because if I had wept, they would have said afterward that I wept. I wanted them to have nothing to say afterward but what happened. He looked at her for a long moment. You are a general, he said. I am a governess, she said, who was raised by a viscount. They did not stay for the country dance. Marbury led her from the saloon by a side door that opened onto a gallery of state portraits, and there, in the dim before the painted eyes of two dead queens, he stopped, and he did what he had wanted to do since the moment the mask had come off. He touched his forehead to hers. He did not kiss her. He put his forehead against hers as a man puts his forehead against a doorpost of a house he means never to leave, and he held it there while a footman 2 rooms away announced the next dance, and while somewhere in the distance a woman's voice, Lady Hyacinth Bertie's voice, could be heard being helped, weeping, into a carriage. I should have spoken sooner, he said. The letter patent was signed in December. I should have brought you into the light in December. You brought me into the light tonight, she said. That is what matters. It is not, he said. You suffered a slap because I waited. I would have suffered 10, she said, for the manner of your answer to it. 3 days passed. On the morning after the ball, the post carried the account word for word upon its second page, and by 10, every coffee-house was reading it aloud. By noon, 4 of the 7 great houses Marbury had named had sent footmen to Bertie House in Half Moon Street, with cards bearing a single word, regretted. By 3, a 5th card came, and by 5 a 6th, and by dusk the 7th, and Lady Hyacinth asked her maid, in a voice she did not recognize, whether any card had come bearing the word, received. The maid said there had not. At Grosvenor Square, Mr. Strickland presented himself at 11 with his brown leather case. He laid upon the Earl's desk 8 papers bearing the wandering signature of Lord Arthur Bertie. The total, added at the bottom in Strickland's copperplate, was £8,140, 6 shillings and 8 pence. Present them, Marbury said. At Coots? At Coots, this morning. And send word to Rundell that the diamond parure shall be needed after all. For the Almack's assembly, my lord? For Almack's. Strickland allowed himself a single dry smile. He had served the Bramwell interest for 31 years, and he had never before seen his master smile in the month of March. He bowed and took his hat and went out into the fog with the 8 papers in his case, and by 2 o'clock, Coots had entered them in the ledger and had sent a clerk to Half Moon Street, and by 4, Lord Arthur Bertie had signed, with a hand that would not stop trembling, the deed of sale upon the family estate of Bertie Priory in Wiltshire, to a solicitor, acting for a party unnamed, the sum agreed being exactly £8,140, 6 shillings and 8 pence, together with a cottage upon the Cornish coast near Boscastle, where Miss Cassandra Bertie should reside for a term of 2 years, unaccompanied by her mother, in the care of a widowed aunt whose name Lord Arthur had not spoken aloud since the year of the peace. Cassandra departed for Cornwall at 7 the next morning, in a hired chaise, with a single trunk, and with no maid. Lady Hyacinth watched from behind the curtain of an upper window and did not come down. That was the 2nd day. Upon the 3rd day, the doors of Almack's assembly rooms opened at 9, and by 9:30 the ballroom was so crowded that the patronesses had been compelled to refuse 300 vouchers. Lady Jersey herself stood at the top of the stair. Lady Cowper stood upon her right. Countess Levin, the Russian ambassador's wife, stood upon her left, and the 3 of them together did not turn from the stair for 1 hour, because they were waiting. The carriage came at 10:30. It was Bramwell's town chariot, painted midnight blue, drawn by 4 blacks with silver harness, and when the door was opened by the footman, there stepped down first the Earl in his black Weston coat, and his cravat, in the mathematical, and behind him, upon his arm, a young woman, in a gown of emerald silk so deep it was almost black in the shadow of the awning, and so bright it seemed lit from within, when she passed beneath a lamp. The bodice was cut square, the sleeves were short and puffed with silver embroidery. About her throat lay the Bramwell emeralds and diamonds, a river of green stones set in old gold that had not been out of their case since the 5th Countess had worn them to greet Queen Charlotte in 1792, and, resting against the collar of them, higher upon her throat, a slender chain of yellow diamonds and small pearls, restored, cleaned, and reset by Rundell in 3 days, the Harcourt necklace of Ravenhill, which her father had put about her mother's neck upon the day of their wedding in the year 6. Upon her head was the tiara. It was neither ostentatious nor small. It was 5 points of emerald set in silver leaves, a piece from the Bramwell strong room described in the inventory as pertaining to the Countess by right, and it caught the lamplight of the vestibule, so that the auburn of her hair beneath it burned copper and gold at once. She wore no mark upon her cheek. 3 days of cold cloths and Mrs. Penhaligon's arnica had done their work, and the porcelain of her skin was clear again but for the sardines of freckles across her nose, which she had not powdered, because Marbury, when she had offered to do so, had said that he had known her by them once in a rose garden, and would know her by them always. Lady Jersey came 3 steps down the stair to meet her. "The Viscountess Harcourt of Ravenhill," said the master of ceremonies from the head of the stairs, in a voice pitched to carry the length of the room, "and the Earl of Bramwell." The ballroom rose. It was not the ordinary rising for a titled entrance. It was every man upon his feet and every lady dipping into a curtsy together, and a small silence held while the two of them, still upon Marbury's arm, moved down the length of the room to the place at the head of the assembly which the patronesses had reserved for them. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at him. He was looking at her already, and had been since the carriage door had opened, and he did not look away throughout the length of the room, nor while the master of ceremonies announced the opening set, nor while the violins began the first bars of a waltz, for the patronesses had ruled that evening, by unanimous vote of all 6, that the waltz should be permitted from the first dance, in honor of the occasion, though it was not their custom. He led her to the center of the floor. He put his gloved hand at the small of her back, an inch below the emerald ribbon of her sash, and the ballroom watched him do it, and the ballroom understood, at last and entirely, that the Ice Lord of Bramwell was in love, and that he did not care who knew it, and that he had not cared, perhaps, for 6 months, but had lacked until this evening the occasion to declare it upon a public floor. They waltzed. Tabitha had been taught the waltz once, at the age of 11, by a French dancing master her father had engaged before the fall, and she had not danced it since. Her feet remembered. Her hand at his shoulder remembered. His hand at her back kept her upon the beat, and when in the 3rd turn she missed a step and would have stumbled, he did not catch her. He steadied her, which is a different thing, and permitted her to recover, and she loved him for that also. Halfway through the dance he bent his head. "I have done a foolish thing," he said. "You have done many foolish things," she said. "Which?" "I have written to the Regent this morning to ask that we be married from Carlton House, as he desired, upon the 1st day of May. That is only 6 weeks. "It is 5.5, said Marbury. "I have counted." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed aloud in a public room since the summer of 1808, and half the ballroom heard it and would remember afterward that the new Countess had laughed at Almack's during her first waltz with her Earl, and that the Earl had not smiled, precisely, but that his eyes had done a thing his mouth had not learned to do since Spain. At the end of the waltz he did not release her hand. He turned her toward the raised chairs where the patronesses sat, and there, in the sight of the room, he lifted her gloved hand to his mouth. He did not kiss her lips. He kissed, once, gravely, the back of the long white kid glove, upon the knuckle beneath which lay her mother's ring, and he held the kiss a moment longer than propriety allowed, and then he let her go, and he offered her his arm again for the promenade. Mrs. Penhaligon, who had been permitted to attend upon the Countess that evening in the guise of a lady's woman, stood in a curtained alcove at the side of the ballroom and touched the corner of her white apron to her eyes and did not care who saw. Later, when the ball had broken into its lesser sets and the great room had thinned enough for private speech, Marbury took Tabitha out onto the small stone balcony that gave upon Waterloo Place. It was cold. Her breath made a small cloud between them. Below in the street, a link boy stamped his feet to warm them, and somewhere a watchman called the hour of 1. She had brought something in her hand. She had carried it wrapped in a small square of silver paper all through the ball, and she had not shown it to him, but she showed it now. It was the boar and the 3 stars. The signet ring of Ravenhill, unpicked from the lining of a grey wool bodice in a servant's passage in Half Moon Street on a night of March snow, and worn, all this while, at the very center of her stays, where no man's eye could reach. "I have carried it," she said, "since the night my mother sewed it in. I do not know how to stop carrying it. He took it from her. He slid it onto the smallest finger of her left hand, above the plain gold band he had given her upon the 16th of December, and the boar and the 3 stars settled there beside the Bramwell knot, as though they had been struck in the same forge. Then do not stop, he said. Only carry it in the light. She looked up at him. The lamplight from the ballroom fell through the tall window across half her face, and left the other half in shadow, and he stood in the same light and the same shadow, and neither of them was cold. Marcus, she said, it was the first time. I did not know, when I answered the advertisement, that it was you. I did not know, until Mrs. Penhaligon opened the door. I knew, he said, when I saw the M in Vale. You never said. I was afraid, he said, that if I told you, you would go. You had gone once. You had gone, at the age of 11, into a servant's hall carrying a signet ring in your bodice, and you had not asked any of us for help. And I thought that if I named you before you had named yourself, I should lose you a second time. She put her ungloved hand, she had drawn the glove off, again, and she did not know when, against the side of his face, where the saber scar crossed the eyebrow. He closed his eyes at the touch. You did not lose me, she said. You saw me. I saw you at 11 years old, he said, in a rose garden, copying receipts for my mother. I saw you in the doorway of my library at 22 in a governess's grey. I saw you tonight upon a marble floor with a handprint upon your cheek. I have not stopped seeing you, Tabitha. That is the only thing of which I have been consistent in the course of my life. She had not meant to weep. She had gone through a slap without weeping, and through a kneeling without weeping, and through a waltz without weeping. She wept now, one tear, and only one, and it fell upon the emerald silk at her breast, and disappeared into the deep green as though the gown had been made to receive it. He bent then and kissed her. Not upon the glove. Upon the mouth, once, very slowly, in the cold March air, with the link boy stamping in the street below, and the fog beginning to move in from the river. It was a kiss, such as the Ice Lord of Bramwell had never given upon a public balcony in the whole of his life, and it lasted the length of the watchman's cry from Pall Mall. When he drew back, he did not step away. He tucked her hand into the crook of his arm and turned her to face the tall lit windows of Almack's, where inside the sets were reforming for the third dance, and the candles were burning low, and where 400 people were, at that very moment, telling one another that they had known all along the copper-haired governess of Half Moon Street had been something else, something more, and had they not said so, from the first? Upon the balcony he spoke once more, quietly, so that only she should hear it. They will say tomorrow, he said, that I chose you, that the Earl of Bramwell chose a penniless widow and made a countess of her. They will tell it that way in every drawing-room from here to Yorkshire. Let them, she said. I did not choose you, he said. You were chosen already, by your father's letter patent and by your mother's ring, and by the girl in the rose garden who copied a receipt so carefully that a boy of 18 remembered the M of her signature for 10 years. I only opened a door. Tabitha Harcourt looked down at the 2 rings upon her left hand, at the emeralds cold and heavy against her throat, at the pale scar of 5 fingers already fading upon her cheek, and at the man beside her who had crossed the length of Carlton House in 3 days, to answer, publicly and finally, a hand that had been raised against her. She thought of a candle stub in a servant's garret. She thought of 6pence for a drop of wax. She thought of a grey wool bodice with a signet ring hidden in its lining, and of the night, 11 years past, when a girl of 11 had walked into the world without a name, and had kept, against every argument to the contrary, the habit of being wholly herself. And she understood, standing there upon the balcony above Waterloo Place with the fog moving in and the violins of Almack's beginning the 3rd set behind the glass, that all of it, the grey dress and the darning and the dropped wax and the boar in the lining, had not been the loss she had thought it was. It had been the long, patient work of being seen. She turned her face up to Marcus Marbury. "Take me in," she said. He took her in. And in the great glittering room of Almack's assembly, before the 6 patronesses of the Ton and the Prince Regent's especial deputy, and every dowager who had ever cut her at a supper table, the Earl of Bramwell led the Viscountess Harcourt of Ravenhill onto the floor, for the 3rd dance of her first ball, in the first true gown she had worn in 11 years, and in a color that was not grey. It was, in the end, a very simple thing. She had been unseen, and she was seen. If this story moved you, stop for a moment and reflect. Have you ever, like Tabitha, carried a signet ring sewn into the lining of a mended dress, a piece of who you truly are, hidden from a world that only saw the ginger scarecrow? Is there someone in your life who, like Marcus Marbury, recognized your handwriting before you ever spoke your real name? And when the slap came in your own ballroom, the false accusation, the crowd staring, did you stand still with your eyes on the marble floor, waiting for the truth to walk across the room and answer for you? Tell us your experiences and feelings in the comments. We read them all. And if you believe in stories about dignity, justice, and love that arrives against all odds, leave a like, be sure to subscribe to the channel, and click join to become a part of our community and help the channel.